Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. The first time I noticed the light was when I crested the hill just past the old quarry road. I drove that route at least 4 times a week, out on County Route G toward the edge of the foothills, where the road twisted through dry grass and low scrub before cutting back toward town. It was early evening, hot dusk, the kind where the sun dipped low, but the heat still lingered in the asphalt. My truck's windows were down, warm air pushing in, smelling faintly of dust and pine. When I reached the top of the hill, the horizon opened up, and that's when I saw it. A bright point of light hovering just above the next distant ridgeline. Not high, not low, just there, clear against the dimming orange sky. At first I thought it was a tower light or something reflecting, but as I started driving down the slope, it didn't shift the way distant lights usually do. It moved with me. My name's Rebecca Ibarra. I lived in a small place outside San Ornelas and worked evenings cleaning offices in the downtown block. That drive was so routine I could do it with my eyes half closed. Except that night, I kept staring at that light. It didn't blink, it didn't flicker. Just a steady bright glow, maybe the size of a distant star, but too low and too defined to be one. As I leveled out and climbed the next ridge, I fully expected it to fall behind or grow closer. It did neither. When I reached the next crest, there it was again, sitting over the next stretch of land like it had always been meant to be there. I glanced in my mirrors, no car behind me with high beams. I looked left and right, trying to find some structure or tower, but there was nothing but rolling terrain and the thin line of trees near the creek. Okay, I whispered to myself, more out of confusion than fear. I kept driving. Another mile, another slow incline, same thing. The light matched my pace perfectly. Not ahead, not behind, just off in the distance, steady as if pinned to the same point in the sky. A strange pressure settled behind my eyes, like the kind you get before a storm. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, even though I hadn't meant to. I told myself it was just some environmental illusion, something caused by haze or leftover heat. Still, a part of me felt watched. The road dipped down into a shallow valley. The light sank with it, disappearing briefly behind the ridge. My heart skipped just a bit. Relief washed in for a second. Then, as I climbed the next rise, it reappeared. Exactly the same position, same brightness, same distance. I swallowed hard. The sun finally dropped below the horizon, leaving the sky pale violet streaked with gray. The air cooled slightly, but a heavy stillness followed. My truck radio crackled, so I twisted the knob off. I didn't want noise. It felt wrong somehow. The light stayed silent. No hum, no rumble, no sign of movement other than the careful way it refused to change position. It was like driving next to something that didn't exist. At one point, I slowed down on purpose. The light slowed too. When I sped up, it glided forward enough to keep the same distance, still hovering above the ridge like it was calmly observing. I pulled over briefly near the old mailbox that marked the broken fence line. The engine idled. Crickets chirped faintly somewhere in the grass. The light hung there unmoving. I stepped out of the truck and stood on the roadside, boots crunching on gravel, eyes trained on it. The sky dimmed further, and the single glow appeared stronger now against the darker shade of approaching night. "Hello?" I called into the open air, feeling ridiculous the moment the word left my mouth. No response. No change. Just that stubborn light. I stood there longer than I meant to, arms crossed loosely, the quiet settling around my skin. It didn't feel aggressive, didn't feel kind either. Just present, like it was marking me on a map only it could see. Finally, I climbed back into the truck and started driving again. The light kept pace. Over the next 10 minutes, it crept just a fraction higher in the sky. Not enough to notice at first, but enough that I had to angle my eyes slightly upward to see it. The road twisted through a narrow cut in the foothills, darkening as shadows from the ridges crept across the pavement. My headlights swept side to side as I followed the curve. The light never wavered. At one point, a thin fog drifted across the next ridge, pale and low. The glow slipped behind it, briefly diffused, creating a soft halo. Then it reemerged, unchanged. The pressure in the air thickened again, like the atmosphere itself felt heavier the longer I drove beneath that thing. My phone's screen lit up briefly on the seat beside me. I glanced down to see if someone was calling. No signal. I tried unlocking it again, same thing. That road never lost service. Not for me. When I looked up, the light had drifted slightly to the right, still keeping pace, but now moving closer to the line of trees that marked the edge of the valley. The silence inside the truck grew suffocating. Even the normal sounds of driving felt muted, as if the world beyond the windows had slipped into a softer version of reality. "Just keep going," I murmured, more as a grounding effort than anything else. The town lights finally became visible in the far distance, a scatter of yellow points that marked the edge of home. As I approached the outskirts, the light hesitated for the first time. It dimmed slightly, then slid sideways at a gentle angle. It didn't rush off, didn't shoot away, just slowly drifted, almost like it had decided it was done pacing me. I rolled into a small turnout just outside town and pulled over again. The glow continued its slow trajectory, moving toward the darker stretch of sky behind the hills. Within moments, it faded into nothing, leaving only empty clouds and the grainy texture of night settling overhead. My heart pounded harder than I realized. I sat there for several minutes, listening to the normal sounds return. A distant truck, wind brushing the tall grass, the occasional chirp of insects. Nothing followed me after that. I drove home on autopilot, shoulders tight the whole way, glancing up at every ridge as if expecting the light to appear again. But the sky stayed quiet. Even so, every time I drove that route afterward, part of me searched the horizon. And when the road crested just right, when the angle hit perfectly, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen still understood my pace better than I ever could. The rain started coming down harder just as I raised the camera again. I'd been standing at the edge of my brother's soybean field for almost 20 minutes, just watching the storm roll in over Winston County. The sky looked like it was folding in on itself, low and heavy, green-gray with streaks of darker cloud threading through it. I'd driven out here after work because the weather app said this storm would be a good one, and I'd always liked taking photos when the light got weird like that. My name's Trevor Mills. I worked as a mechanic in a small shop outside of Ashford, Minnesota. This field was technically my brother Ryan's property, but he never cared if I walked it. He was out of town that night anyway, so it was just me and a wall of clouds inching closer. Thunder rolled low and slow, like something huge shifting its weight behind the sky. I stepped back a little as the wind picked up, flattening the tops of the soybean plants in waves. The air felt charged, heavy, not just storm heavy, more like the entire horizon had a pressure behind it. I lifted my camera again and took a few more shots, adjusting the exposure to catch the darker tones. Each time lightning flashed, the cloud shapes looked different. Twisted, layered, like they were sliding over each other. At one point, I hesitated before pressing the shutter. I don't know why exactly, just a weird instinct that something didn't look right. I took the photo anyway. Another low rumble echoed across the land, and the first fat drops of rain started hitting the gravel path behind me. I turned toward my truck, figuring I'd sit inside and watch the rest from there. As I walked back, my phone buzzed with a weather alert, and I slid it back into my pocket without looking. The wind kept rising, carrying the smell of wet soil and something metallic. I climbed into the driver's seat and shut the door, listening as the rain intensified, drumming against the roof. Through the windshield, the clouds churned in slow motion, almost like they were breathing. Out of habit, I checked the camera screen to review the last few shots. Most of them looked how you'd expect. Dark sky, streaks of rain, distant lightning. Then I swiped to the one I'd hesitated on. There, just beneath the lowest layer of cloud, floated a faint, smooth shape. Oval, maybe, but not sharply defined, like a soft outline barely pressed into the sky. It looked almost reflective, but diffused, like light hitting fog wrapped around something solid. My eyes snapped back up to the sky outside the windshield. Nothing was there, just the storm. I looked back at the photo, zoomed in. The shape didn't sharpen. It stayed smooth and strangely uniform, not matching any cloud texture around it. I opened the door and stepped back out, rain soaking through my shirt as I scanned the clouds again. No object, no break, no odd reflection, just wind and thunder. I stood there getting drenched, staring up, trying to line up the photo with what I was seeing. The same section of sky now looked completely empty. A flash of lightning lit up the whole field, and for a split second my eyes caught movement. But when the darkness returned, it was gone. I lowered the camera, heart beating slow but heavier than before. Maybe it was just a weird distortion, a trick of lighting, the lens catching something at the wrong angle. I got back in the truck and shut the door again. That's when I noticed the radio had turned itself off. I hadn't touched the knob. I flicked it back on. Static crackled before the local station came through again. Country music, scratchy and warped through the storm interference. As I pulled onto the road to head back into town, the sky grew darker, like the storm had deepened instead of passed. My headlights reflected off the rainfall, and the world narrowed to the stretch of wet asphalt ahead of me. I kept glancing at the camera in the passenger seat. After a mile or so, the rain eased into a steady drizzle. I pulled over at a small turnout near a line of trees, killed the engine, and got out again. Something felt unfinished. The air was cooler now, very still. No wind. The storm clouds didn't look as chaotic, just a thick ceiling hanging low above the empty farmland. I raised the camera again and aimed upward, carefully scanning the same general area. Through the viewfinder, everything appeared normal. I snapped another photo, then another. On the third, the same faint, smooth shape showed again, slightly shifted, but still there, still hovering under the cloud line. My stomach dropped. I lowered the camera slowly and looked directly at the sky. Still nothing. But the rain had stopped entirely. No birds, no insects, no distant highway noise, just quiet and clouds pressing down. I reviewed the image again. The shape hadn't sharpened, hadn't changed, but it looked more defined in that moment than it had earlier. Almost like it had a surface. I found myself whispering, "That wasn't there." The engine of my truck clicked softly as it cooled. A low vibration passed through the ground under my feet, faint but noticeable, like the earth shifting just slightly. I turned in a slow circle. Nothing moved. Then overhead, a dim glow pulsed through the clouds for less than a second. Not lightning. Too soft. Too even. My head tilted back instinctively, but the clouds returned to their dull gray. I backed toward my truck without taking my eyes off the sky. The camera strap brushed against my wrist, and I jumped more than I should have. I got inside, locked the doors without thinking, and started the engine. The dashboard lit up normally, but the radio hissed again briefly before settling. As I drove, the feeling of being watched crept in, subtle but constant, like someone just outside my peripheral vision. I checked the mirrors. Empty road. No headlights. No movement. When I reached Ashford, the storm had faded like it never happened. Pavement was wet, but the sky had already lightened to a dull charcoal. I stopped by the convenience store out of habit and went inside to clear my head. Kelsey, the cashier, glanced up from her phone. "That storm hit you too?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Weird one." She nodded. "Heard thunder but never saw any lightning." I didn't reply. Back home, I unloaded the camera and set it on the kitchen counter. The house felt normal, quiet, safe. The familiar hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. I sat at the table and uploaded the photos onto my laptop. The strange shape appeared in 4 separate images, all taken within the same general time frame. In each one, it hovered just beneath the cloud ceiling, smooth and faint, but it never appeared in the exact same spot, like it was drifting. Yet every time I'd looked up, there'd been nothing. I leaned back, eyes tired, trying to make sense of it without fully thinking about it. My phone buzzed on the counter beside me. A text from Ryan. "Storm hit here." "You okay?" "Yeah." I typed back. "Just got back." "You ever get those weird colors in the sky?" he replied. I stared at the screen. Sometimes I typed. That night, I slept poorly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smooth, impossible outline against the clouds. Just before midnight, I stood on my back porch, mug of coffee cooling in my hand, watching the open sky. The storm had long passed, leaving behind a clear stretch dotted with stars. I thought I was calm again. Then, far above, the same faint shape glided slowly across a patch of darker sky, blotting out a handful of stars as it passed. No sound. No trail. Just a soft absence of light moving against the night. I lowered my mug and watched it fade into nothing. When I looked down, my hands were slightly shaking. My alarm was already turned off when my eyes opened. The room was still dark, the faint blue glow from my phone resting on the nightstand barely cutting through the shadows. I reached for it, squinting, expecting the usual screen telling me to get up for work. Instead, the display showed the alarm had been silenced at 2:09 a.m. I stared at the time for a second, trying to line it up with reality. I hadn't woken at 2:09. I knew that. I'd gone to bed around 11, fell asleep watching some dumb cooking video, and that was it. I unlocked the phone and opened the log. It clearly said alarm dismissed, 2:09 a.m. No record of me hitting snooze, no accidental screen swipe, just off. My name's Eli Mercer. I rented a small place in Harbor Point, one of those quiet coastal towns that looked peaceful on postcards but felt almost too still at night. My bedroom window faced the water, and usually I could hear the slow slap of waves against the dock across the road. That morning, it was silent. I sat up slowly and listened. No wind, no gulls, no distant traffic. The air inside felt strangely heavy, almost warm despite the cool forecast. The digital clock on my nightstand said 6:17 a.m., so nearly 4 hours had passed since that alarm activity. I rubbed my face and checked the phone again, half expecting the log to update or correct itself. It didn't. A tight, unsettled feeling crept up my chest. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, walking toward the window. The fog outside was thick, rolling in from the bay in low waves, muting the world into pale gray shapes. The dock lights were still on, glowing soft and hazy through the mist. That's when I noticed it. A pale light hung low over the water, hovering just above the shoreline. Not a boat light, not a reflection. Something separate. It drifted slowly to the right, silent, smooth, unbothered by the fog around it. I pressed my forehead lightly against the glass, eyes following it. The light continued gliding, maintaining the same height and speed, almost sliding along an invisible track above the surface. No ripples disturbed the water below it. No sound accompanied it. A faint pressure built behind my ears, like when the air changes before a storm. I whispered, "Okay, what is that?" even though no one was there to hear it. The glow dimmed slightly, then slipped deeper into the fog and vanished. The silence closed in again. I stood there another minute, phone still in hand, trying to shake the unease crawling under my skin. Finally, I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, hoping routine might settle whatever this was. As I set the glass down, the phone buzzed. Still no signal. I checked the Wi-Fi. Full bars. The internet worked fine, but cell service read 0. That didn't happen in the apartment. Ever. I glanced back into the hallway. The air felt heavier than before, almost like the room was holding its breath. I tried to remember anything from the night, anything at all that might explain the log showing I'd turned off my own alarm. Nothing came, just sleep. Or what I thought was sleep. A few minutes later, there was a soft thump from outside, not loud enough to startle, but heavy enough to notice. I walked to the front door and cracked it open. The hallway lights flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the fog hugged the railings and steps. I stepped onto the narrow balcony and scanned the horizon. Nothing moved. No glow, no sound, just the faint drip of water from the eaves. My downstairs neighbor, Clara, opened her door across the walkway, hair messy and eyes tired. "You hear anything weird last night?" she asked. I hesitated. "Like what?" Thought I heard footsteps up on the roof around 2 or 3. Figured it was raccoons or something. My stomach tightened. "Yeah," I said carefully. "I heard something too. Not sure what it was." She yawned and nodded. "Probably nothing," she muttered, already turning back inside. But the way she said it didn't carry much confidence. I went back into my place, closing the door softly behind me. The quiet returned, thick and unsettling. Later that morning, I drove to the grocery store. The sky stayed overcast, fog flashing in and out across the road. Everything felt normal again on the surface. Cars moved, people walked dogs. Life kept its usual rhythm. Still, a faint sense of being out of step followed me. When I returned home around noon, my phone finally showed signal again. No new messages, no missed calls, nothing out of place. That night, I set my alarm carefully and placed the phone face up on the nightstand. I wanted proof. I wanted to know if I was somehow doing this to myself. Sleep came slowly. Sometime after midnight, I woke unexpectedly. The room felt warmer than before, almost stale. A faint hum pressed lightly into the silence, like vibration through the walls rather than a sound. My eyes opened halfway. The phone screen glowed softly. 2:09 a.m., and the alarm slider was halfway moved, as if someone had just brushed it. I froze, breath shallow. The hum intensified slightly, then faded. Through the sheer curtain, a thin, pale light traced slowly across the fog outside, just beyond the window frame. Not entering, not directly shining in, just passing. I turned my head to watch it. It moved steadily past the glass, stayed visible for a few seconds, then disappeared beyond the building. The air cooled again. The hum dissolved. The phone screen dimmed back to black. I checked the alarm. It was off. My hand trembled slightly as I locked the screen. I lay there the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, afraid to blink too long. Morning arrived without drama. The sky cleared slightly, the fog thinning down to a light haze. The world looked normal. Quiet, but normal. When I checked my phone again, the log displayed the same thing. Alarm dismissed, 2:09 a.m., no other action recorded. No calls, no movement, just interruption. I went about my day anyway, trying not to dwell on it, but every faint sound felt amplified. Every reflection against the water caught my attention. The next night, I didn't sleep much. I waited. 2:09 came and went, with no hum, no glow, no movement. But just before dawn, while making coffee, I glanced at the water once more. Out beyond the pier, faint and distant, a pale light drifted slowly across the fog, quiet and steady, before blending seamlessly into the gray sky. The first one looked like a slow star that didn't belong where it was. I noticed it while sitting on the hood of my car, parked at the overlook above Crescent Bluff. It was just past midnight, warm and a little windy, the kind of night where you could still smell the dry grass even after dark. I'd come up there to clear my head after a rough shift. Nothing dramatic, just needed some quiet. My name's Marco Hensley. I lived a few minutes outside town in a rental off Route 18. This overlook sat on a rise that faced miles of low hills and farmland. I'd been up there plenty of times. Normally you'd see planes, satellites, the occasional slow drone from someone messing around. This wasn't any of those. The light moved sideways, stopped, then shifted diagonally. Clean, deliberate motions. It didn't blink. It didn't leave a trail. It just slid across the sky like it was tracing lines only it knew. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, watching closer. Then another light appeared to the left, same brightness, same distance. It moved in the opposite direction but matched the first one's pace perfectly. After a few seconds, both lights arced into a loose circle, then cut through the middle of it at right angles, geometric. That was the only way to describe it, like someone sketching shapes on invisible glass. I pulled my phone out, aiming the camera upward, but the screen barely picked up anything, just dark with a faint blur where the light should have been. In real life, it was clear as day. A third light showed up above them, a little dimmer, and that's when I felt my stomach tighten. Not panic, not full fear, just that slow creeping feeling like something had noticed me without me understanding how. The air felt heavier, like the breeze had stalled. Even the usual night sounds from down the hill seemed muted. The three lights started moving together now, forming angles that made no sense on instinct, but still looked precise. One would move, the others followed, like they were locked into the same path, but offset slightly. I checked the time. 12:14 a.m. I kept watching, barely blinking. The shapes shifted from lines into something that looked almost like a rotating square, though the corners were never perfectly connected. It was like the idea of a square instead of the thing itself. My car radio clicked on by itself for half a second, just static. Then it shut off again. I turned my head toward the driver's seat, then back to the sky. The lights kept moving, slow and steady. No sound, no hum, just silent motion in patterns that made my eyes ache slightly after a while. A gust of wind ran up the hill suddenly, cool and sharp, lifting dust and dry leaves around my feet. The smell of dirt got stronger. I stood up, stretching my back, still staring upward. That's when one of the lights dropped lower. Not fast, just a controlled descent. It was still far away, but now it felt closer than anything should. The other two continued their pattern while the lower one drifted off to the side, almost like it was circling the outline of the hill. My phone screen dimmed, even though it was fully charged. I tapped it, waking it again. Everything looked normal. I glanced over my shoulder at the empty stretch of road behind me. No headlights, no movement. When I looked back up, the lights had shifted formation again. Now they were aligned in a shallow curve, rising and falling in slow rhythm like something breathing. I felt stupid just standing there, but I couldn't move. My brain kept trying to attach logic to it. Military test. Atmospheric weirdness. Some drone tech I didn't know about. None of it fit. The lowest light paused mid-sky and pulsed once, very faint. Just a slightly deeper glow for a second, not bright enough to light the ground, not enough to cast shadows. It reminded me of someone flicking a lighter behind frosted glass. My hands felt colder now. The night air pressed in around me, quiet and watchful. The trailing light slowly rose back up until all three were level again. They reformed the strange angled patterns, looping through invisible shapes that felt almost purposeful. Then, one by one, they started to dim. Not flicker, not vanish, just fade, as if distance itself was swallowing them. The sky behind them didn't change, no cloud cover, no haze thick enough to justify it. They simply grew less solid until they looked like thin pinpricks, then nothing. The night returned to normal. Wind moved again. Crickets picked up where they left off. I stood there another minute, looking at the empty sky, trying to convince myself it was done. The feeling didn't leave. I walked back around the car and sat inside, door still open, watching above the windshield. My heart beat faster than it should have, but not in a rush. More like it was bracing for something that didn't show. Another faint light appeared higher up, much dimmer than before. It didn't join any pattern. It just hovered there, perfectly still. Then it slid upward, not towards space, not sideways, but like it was dissolving straight into the darkness above. It slowly thinned until it blended into the black sky like smoke pulled backward. I closed the car door and started the engine without thinking. The dashboard lit normally, no warnings, no glitches. Driving home, every hill felt too quiet. I kept glancing up through the windshield, half expecting to see those shapes again, hovering above the road, back, tracing silent grids over rooftops and power lines. Nothing followed me. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light glowed the same dull yellow it always had. The house looked normal. Still, I waited a second before getting out. Inside, everything sounded ordinary. The fridge, the fan, the light buzz above the sink. I checked the time again, 12:47 a.m. It didn't feel like 30 minutes had passed. Through my bedroom window, the sky looked calm and empty. No strange motion, no glow. But every time I closed my eyes, I still pictured those impossible shapes moving in slow, careful patterns, like something was testing how the sky itself could bend before letting it quietly swallow the evidence. The hum started while I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing out a coffee mug I'd barely used. It was low and steady, not loud enough to panic over, but deep enough that I felt it more than heard it. At first, I thought it was someone's car idling outside or one of those distant highway trucks you usually forget about after a minute. It didn't fade, though. It held the same tone, the same pressure, like something was resting on the air itself. I turned the faucet off and just stood there, listening. Outside, the sky was that dull orange-gray it gets just before full dark, thick with humidity. It had been one of those sticky summer evenings where your shirt clings to your back no matter what you do. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked toward the front window. My name's Malcolm Ortega. I lived alone in a small house on Birchview Lane, just outside Cedar Grove. It was a quiet block, mostly older couples and a few families who moved out here for the schools and the space. The hum was still there when I pulled back the curtain. Nothing looked off. No flashing lights, no people standing around, just porches, driveways, and the usual mix of lawn chairs and potted plants. Mrs. Hawthorne across the street was out watering her flowers, head down, hose looping around her feet. She didn't seem to notice anything. I stepped onto my front porch, the wood still warm from the day. The hum felt clearer out there, almost wrapping around my ears. It didn't come from any specific direction. North, south, overhead, it just existed. I looked nothing. Just a heavy sky and thin streaks of cloud barely moving. I checked my phone, thinking maybe it was some weird construction noise or utility thing. No alerts, no messages. Then I noticed the porch lights. Every single one that was on along the block flickered at the exact same time. Not a normal flicker either. More like a quick dim out, half second of darkness, then back on. It wasn't just my place. It was everyone's. The hum cut off right after. The silence that followed felt unnatural, like when someone suddenly turns off a big industrial fan and your ears haven't adjusted yet. I stood there a moment longer, waiting for it to come back. It didn't. Mrs. Hawthorne straightened up and squinted toward my house. "You hear that?" she called. "Yeah," I said. "What was it?" She shrugged. "Sounded like the power lines." "But the lights just flickered," I said. She glanced around, eyebrows tightened. "Storm, maybe?" The sky didn't say storm, no wind, no thunder, just thick, still air. I went back inside, but the uneasy feeling didn't leave. It settled somewhere behind my ribs, like the air pressure had changed inside me too. 20 minutes passed. I tried distracting myself with TV, scrolling through channels, but I kept hearing phantom echoes of the hum, like my brain refused to let it go. When I finally stepped back outside, the porch light stayed steady, but the air felt colder, like something had drained a layer of warmth without warning. I walked down the steps and onto the sidewalk. The rest of the street looked normal again. Dogs barking in the distance, someone starting a car 2 houses down. The sense of routine creeping back in. Still, something felt wrong. Halfway down the block, the quieter this time, but present, like it was testing something. I froze in place, eyes scanning upward. Nothing. Then the porch lights flickered again. Not just mine, all of them. The same exact moment. The hum stopped again. I swallowed hard and exhaled slowly. A neighbor, Jonah Ramirez, stepped out onto his porch, keys dangling loosely from his hand. "Did you see that?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Twice now." He shook his head. "Transformer, maybe? Wouldn't it just cut power instead of doing that?" I said. He didn't answer, just stared down the street like he expected to see someone explaining it. The sky had shifted darker now. Not night yet, but close. I started walking back toward my porch, feeling that same pressure again, maybe even heavier. Like being watched, but not directly. More like being noticed. As I reached my driveway, I heard it again. This time it wasn't constant. It pulsed. Low, low, slightly higher, then flat again. I turned slowly, scanning the roofs, the tree line, the empty stretch of road leading toward the hill. Behind the cloud cover, something brightened faintly, almost like light pushing through fabric. Not lightning. Too smooth, too steady. The hum stopped mid-cycle. Every porch light flickered again. And I noticed something else. The air itself had gone still, not a leaf moving, no breeze. I stepped back instinctively, one foot bumping the edge of the top stair. For just a second, above the houses, there was a pale glow sliding sideways behind the clouds. No hard edges, just a soft brightness that didn't behave like planes or satellites. It glided, paused, then continued. I tried to focus on it, but it thinned out, blended into the sky, and disappeared. The normal world slowly reclaimed its sound. Wind brushing leaves. Crickets starting again. Someone laughing with their phone on speaker somewhere down the road. My porch light didn't flicker again. I went inside, locked the door more out of habit than fear, and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. My heart wasn't racing, but it felt heavier than it should have. I checked every room, even though I knew no one was there. Everything else was normal. Still, I kept glancing at the ceiling like something might press through it. Later that night, as I lay in bed with the window cracked open, the air felt thick again. The same faint vibration tickled my ears. The hum was back, softer than before. I sat up and looked toward the window. The sky outside glowed faintly behind the tree line, like distant light bleeding through. Out on the street, every porch light flickered once more, together, then silence. The power went out right as I was rinsing a mug in the kitchen sink, and everything dropped into that dull, heavy quiet you only notice when it happens all at once. No fridge hum, no heater, no little buzz from the overhead light, just stillness and the faint sound of wind pushing snow against the windows. My name's Elise Krawiec. I lived alone in a small brick house on the edge of Maple Run, a quiet suburban strip that normally felt too boring to hold anything strange. That night was already off, though. The snow had started earlier than forecast, thick flakes piling up fast, muffling the whole neighborhood like someone threw padding over the world. I stood there, hands still wet, waiting for the lights to flicker back. They didn't. I grabbed my phone and saw no signal. Not surprising. Storms messed with it sometimes. I sighed and dried my hands on my sweatshirt, stepping into the living room. That's when I saw it. A pale glow pressed through the curtains, soft and wide like a muted moonlight, but lower, closer. The curtain fabric caught the light and turned it into this faint silvery wash across the wall and coffee table. At first I thought maybe one of the neighbors had a generator or a truck had pulled up outside, but the glow didn't flicker or move. It just sat there, steady and calm. I walked closer, heart tapping faster in a slow, annoyed rhythm. "Hello?" I muttered, feeling dumb immediately. The street outside should have been dark. During outages, the whole block usually dipped into total black. But this light didn't feel like street lighting. It didn't hum. It didn't streak. It didn't cast shadows the way headlights did. It just existed. I pulled the curtain back slightly, expecting to see a car, maybe Todd from across the street checking on his snowblower or some utility truck parked crookedly. There was nothing. Snow covered the sidewalk, pristine and smooth. No tire tracks, no footprints. The glow wasn't coming from any visible source. It just hung there, suspended a little above the street, like a hovering fog that shone instead of clouded. My breath fogged the glass as I stared. A faint blur shifted inside the glow. Not a shape exactly, just a slightly darker patch moving lazily from one side to the other. It reminded me of how fish sometimes move behind cloudy water. I stepped back. Something about the silence bothered me more than the light. No cars, no wind anymore, not even the distant crunch of someone walking their dog. The heating kicked off completely, and the house dropped a degree fast. I wrapped my arms around myself and kept watching. The glow pulsed once. Very soft, like a heartbeat. I checked the time on my phone, 8:42 p.m. It felt later. I tried the light switch just to see if anything flickered. Still dead. The glow outside brightened slightly, enough that my living room looked dim but visible, outlines of furniture clear where only shadows should have been. I noticed dust motes drifting through the beam, slow and aimless. Then I heard a faint tapping sound from somewhere above the house. Not on the roof exactly, more like a dull pressure shifting, the way ice expands in pipes but slower. I froze, eyes still fixed on the curtains. The darker patch inside the glow moved again, this time lower, like it was tracing the outline of the front yard. It didn't look solid, just an absence in brightness. I edged closer to the door and pressed my palm lightly to the cool glass. No heat, no vibration, just cold and very faint static, like when you touched an old TV. The glow held steady. Then, as suddenly as it came, the power snapped back on. The living room light blinked overhead. The heater groaned back to life. The fridge whirred. Sound rushed back into the house like water filling an empty bowl, and the glow vanished. Outside was pure darkness again, except for the normal porch lights down the block slowly turning back on, one by one. The snow remained untouched. I stood there breathing shallow, staring through the window, expecting to see anything that made sense. A truck driving away, someone moving, even just a shift in the air. Nothing. I unlocked the front door and stepped onto the porch, boots crunching softly into fresh snow. The air hit cold and sharp, but clean. No strange haze, no scent except snow and damp concrete. The street looked exactly how it always did after a storm. Silent. Ordinary. I walked a few steps down the path and studied the area where the glow had been, but the ground showed no tracks, no melted spots, nothing flattened or disturbed. My phone buzzed suddenly with a missed text notification from my sister Mara, sent 40 minutes earlier. I hadn't heard it come through. I checked the time again. 9:07 p.m. I didn't remember 40 minutes passing at all. I headed back inside, locking the door behind me and flipping the porch light back off. The house felt normal again, but heavier somehow, like the walls had absorbed something and didn't know where to put it. I sat on the couch, staring at the curtained window, waiting for the glow to return. It didn't. The snow kept falling outside, steady and dumb, soft flakes catching faint reflection from the street lamps. Cars passed occasionally now, tires hissing over the wet road. I tried distracting myself, scrolling through my phone, reheating my tea, anything that made the night feel routine again. Every few minutes I glanced toward the window. Nothing. Close to midnight, I finally forced myself to turn in. The bedroom was colder than usual, but not unbearable. I left a small lamp on, just enough to break the dark. When I slid under the blankets, I noticed the faintest flicker of pale light sweep across the opposite wall, like a reflection from a passing mirror. I rolled to face the window. Outside, far above the rooftop, something pale drifted slowly across the snow-heavy clouds. Dim enough, I almost thought I imagined it. It moved smoothly, then thinned and blended into the gray sky until it became another layer of night. My alarm clock read 12:03 a.m. The power stayed steady. No flickering, no more tapping sounds, just quiet and the slow hum of normal life. I lay there until my breathing evened out again, listening to the heater cycle, the distant hush of trees shifting under snow. Everything stayed where it belonged. By morning, the street looked ordinary. Plows ran through early, neighbors brushed off cars, dogs pulled at leashes, and no one mentioned anything strange. But I kept thinking about that soft glow pressing through my curtains, calm and patient, like it had been waiting for something I didn't understand. My flashlight caught a sharp flash off something metallic about 30 yards ahead, right in the middle of the field. It was too clean and bright to be dew or glass or the moon hitting something random. It looked solid, like the side of a car or polished steel. I stopped walking and stood there, listening. The night was quiet, the kind where even crickets sounded distant. A thin layer of clouds covered most of the sky, so there wasn't much moonlight. I clicked the flashlight again, aiming toward the exact spot. Nothing, just tall grass bending slightly in the breeze. My name's Daniel Rivas. I'd been cutting across the old Kilmer field on my way home from my cousin's place. It was a shortcut I'd taken 100 times, even at night. The farmer who owned it didn't care as long as nobody messed with the crops. It was late summer, hot all day, but the air had cooled off just enough to feel damp and heavy. I walked forward slowly, keeping the flashlight steady. My shoes brushed through the grass, leaving a narrow trail. The spot where the reflection had been looked completely normal now. No metal, no disturbance, not even flattened grass. I stood there and swept the beam in a wide arc. Still nothing. I told myself it had to be something dumb. A beer can. A broken reflector. Maybe my eyes just caught a weird angle of moisture. Even with that thought, I felt off. The air felt thicker than it should have, like my skin knew something before my brain did. I checked my phone, no notifications, no weird time changes. It said 10:47 p.m. I kept walking. A minute later, the reflection happened again. This time, closer, maybe 20 feet ahead. It was brief but clear, that same smooth metallic gleam. I stopped again, my heart starting to beat harder than it should have. "Hey," I called out, half expecting some drunk neighbor or teen to answer back. Nothing responded, no movement, no wind picking up. Just that quiet stretch of rural land with the faint outline of the tree line in the distance. I walked forward, slower this time, my flashlight shaking just slightly. Every step felt heavier, like the ground was softer than usual, even though it wasn't. When I reached the spot, the grass was untouched again. No object, no mark, no sign anyone had been there. Not even a footprint. Behind me, the field was darker than before. The ambient glow from the town lights felt dimmer, like the darkness had grown closer without me noticing. Then I heard it, a low hum. Not loud, not sharp, just a soft vibration that sounded like it was coming from everywhere. It wasn't mechanical exactly, more like a pressure in my ears. I turned slowly in a circle. The sound didn't change. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied. A few steps further, the hum deepened just a little. Enough that I noticed it even through my breathing. I aimed the light toward the tree line again and saw movement. Not fast, not slow, just a subtle shift in shadow that didn't belong. It wasn't a person, it wasn't an animal. It was like a shape that didn't fully catch the beam, as if the light wasn't sure how to touch it. I squinted, trying to force focus. It didn't feel threatening exactly, just wrong. The hum grew quieter. Then the metallic reflection hit again, this time off to my right. I turned fast, heart jolting. Empty grass, no object. My breathing sounded too loud in my own ears. I felt exposed, like the field had suddenly opened wider than it ever had. I checked my phone again, 11:06 p.m. It hadn't felt like that much time passed. The humidity pressed against my skin, sweat trickled down my side even though I wasn't moving much now. And then something shifted overhead. Not a bird, not wind, just the faintest movement in the clouds where they bulged slightly downward and held there for a second longer than they normally would. A dull glow pulsed behind them. Not bright, just enough to notice. The hum stopped. The glow drifted sideways, smooth and steady, then thinned until it disappeared completely. All at once, the normal sounds of night returned. Crickets, distant traffic, a dog barking somewhere closer to the road. The air felt lighter again, like a door had been cracked open and closed without me seeing it. I stood there another minute, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen anything meaningful, trying to replay it logically. Metal reflection, weird lighting, fatigue, overactive imagination. I started walking again, faster now, not quite running, but close. The field no longer felt like a shortcut, it felt like dead space. Halfway across, the hum returned for just a second, softer than before. Enough that the short hairs on my arms lifted, then silence. The path near the road came back into view, gravel crunching under my shoes as I stepped out of the grass. Streetlights flared slightly in the distance, normal and reassuring. I looked back once. The field looked the same as it always had, flat, uneventful. Just grass and shadow. No shimmer, no glow, no shape. I walked the rest of the way home without stopping. Inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, trying to slow my breathing. The house creaked the way it always did. The fridge hummed. My phone still showed 11:06 p.m. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. Outside, through the window, the sky settled back into its usual quiet. No glow, no movement. But every time I closed my eyes, I could still see that flash of smooth metal sitting in an empty field that never showed what it belonged to. I was halfway through telling Naomi about the weird customer from earlier when the wind just stopped. Not slowed, not softened. It cut out like a switch had been flicked somewhere above us. We were walking along the old coastal path that wrapped around the cliffs near Sandmere Point. The kind of place locals swore they loved, but rarely actually used. It was late afternoon, the sky heavy with gray clouds that kept threatening rain but never committing. The ocean below was restless, dull steel blue, waves smacking the rocks in slow, tired rhythms. I noticed the silence first, then the way my hair fell flat against my neck. Naomi stopped too, squinting up. "That feels weird," she said. I looked overhead. The clouds were still moving, sliding west like normal weather, thick and layered, but the air around us stayed dead. The grass stopped bending. The faint salt smell just hung there. No breeze at all. Naomi laughed it off. "Storm's playing games," she said, and kept walking. I followed, but something about it stuck to me. The way everything else kept going, but the wind. Like the space around us wasn't paying attention. A few steps later, the distant waves sounded muffled, like someone threw a heavy blanket over the shoreline. Our footsteps on the gravel path felt louder than they should have been. We kept talking, but it felt forced now. Naomi's voice echoed slightly, even though there was nothing around to bounce the sound back. Halfway down the path, the air grew warmer, not humid, just wrong, like standing too close to someone else's breath. "Do you feel that?" I asked. She nodded, rubbing her arms. "Yeah, I hate this place sometimes." Ahead of us, near the point where the trail narrowed, I noticed the fog rolling in faster than before. Not from the water, but along the cliffs themselves. Thick, pale mist curling over the rock ledge like smoke slipping downward. But even that fog wasn't moving the air. When we reached the narrowing, Naomi slowed. "Let's just turn around. This is creeping me out." That's when everything went quiet. Not just the ocean, not just the wind, no birds, no distant traffic, no waves. Just this hollow silence that felt like standing inside a sealed box. I looked around, heart thudding slow and heavy. Above us, the clouds kept drifting, but directly overhead, there was a break forming, a wide oval stretch where the gray thinned out. The edges of it looked smoother than natural. Naomi noticed it too. "Is that normal?" We stood there, shoulders tense, both staring up. In the center of that thinning patch, the light shifted, just slightly. A pale, muted brightness growing through, not sunlight, not moonlight. It didn't cast shadows, it just made the sky look thinner. Then the humming started. Low, steady, barely audible at first, like a distant power line, but there were no towers nearby. It vibrated faintly through my chest, not loud enough to hurt, just enough to register. Naomi swallowed. "Do you hear that?" I didn't answer. I only nodded. The light above pulsed once, soft and hazy, like a slow inhale. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out automatically, but the screen showed no signal, no clock, no anything. Just black. "That doesn't make sense," I muttered. Naomi stepped closer to me, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. We should go. But neither of us moved. The humming deepened, not louder, just heavier, like it pressed down on everything. My ears felt full, like altitude sickness creeping in. The clouds outside that oval continued their normal drift, but the ones forming the shape held perfectly still, like frozen cotton pulled tight over invisible structure. Then something darker slid behind it. Not a shape with edges, just a deeper shadow, passing under the thin light as though something massive drifted across the underside of the clouds. Naomi whispered, "What is that?" I didn't know. I still don't. It moved slowly, deliberate, as if gliding, and as it passed overhead, the air pressure shifted. I felt it in my jaw, my sinuses, like standing near a large truck, but without noise or wind. My heartbeat felt too loud in my own ears. The humming paused. Absolute silence again. Then a sharper vibration rippled through the ground beneath us, subtle but real. Gravel shifted under our shoes. I finally tore my gaze downward, just out of instinct, and noticed the tall grass to the side was standing perfectly upright, not swaying, not reacting, like it was pinned in place. When I looked back up, the pale light had dimmed slightly, but the darker mass was still there, stretching long, shapeless, slow. Naomi squeezed my arm hard, nails digging through my sleeves. That we need to leave. Now. I nodded, but my legs hesitated, like my body didn't believe what my brain was screaming. The humming returned, softer, almost gentle, and the light began to thin, pulling inward toward the center of that oval space. The shadow shifted once more, like it rotated, and then it faded, not moving away, just dissolving until the cloud cover thickened again. The wind snapped back on. Sudden and sharp. Grass bent. Fog scattered. Waves grew louder all at once. We both gasped, like underwater swimmers breaking the surface. "What the hell was that?" Naomi breathed. "I don't know," I said, voice shaking, even if I tried to steady it. We didn't walk. We half-jogged back down the path, not looking up again, boots crunching too loudly against the gravel as if to reinforce reality. By the time we reached the parking area, the air felt normal again, cold and coastal and damp. The clouds rolled overhead like any other ugly pre-storm sky. Cars passed on the nearby road. A gull cried somewhere out beyond the cliffs. Everything normal. Too normal. Naomi stood by her car, rubbing her face like she could wipe the moment away. "You felt that, right? The air just stopping?" "Yeah." "And the sound?" "Yeah." She let out a dry laugh that didn't match her eyes. "Good, at least I'm not losing it alone." We didn't hang around, just awkward goodbyes, quick glances back at the sky, and then we drove separate ways. The whole ride home, I kept checking my mirrors and windows, expecting that strange stillness to return. But the breeze kept brushing the roadside trees. Everything moved like it was supposed to. When I got home, my phone suddenly reconnected like nothing ever happened. Messages rolled in from earlier, missed notifications, normal life piling back up. But later, that night, as I stood at my kitchen window, I noticed the clouds drifting slow across the moon again. And for just a second, right where the sky had thinned above the cliff path, one small patch moved differently. Too smooth, too deliberate. The air inside my house stayed perfectly still. The light had just turned red at the corner of Vesper and Langley, and I was sitting there waiting, half listening to the radio and half watching the sky through my windshield. It was close to midnight, late enough that the city had thinned out, but not empty. I'd just left my cousin Bryce's place after helping him move a couch that barely fit through his stairwell, and my shoulders still felt sore and stiff. The air outside was warm for October, dry and heavy, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to cool off or hold on to summer. My name's Kieran Solis. I lived on the east side of town, the kind of neighborhood where porch lights stayed on all night and most people pretended they didn't know each other. I leaned back in the driver's seat, drumming my fingers against the steering wheel, watching the moon hang low and yellow over the buildings. It looked full, bright enough to cast faint silver lines over the tops of parked cars. Then it started to dim, not like a cloud sliding over it. It just muted slowly, like someone turning down a dial. The edges stayed sharp, no haze, no color change around it, just less light. I squinted and leaned forward slightly. That's when the shadow crossed it. A dark shape moved cleanly across the surface of the moon, smooth and deliberate, not trailing, not jittery, just one long, quiet glide from left to right. Too steady to be a bird, too close to the surface to be a plane, and way too clean to be a cloud. The radio cut to static for a split second and then returned. I didn't even notice the light had changed green until the car behind me honked. I flinched, put my foot on the gas, and rolled forward through the intersection, but my eyes kept drifting back toward the sky through the side window. The moon was normal again. Bright, clear, as if nothing touched it. No way, I muttered. I slowed on purpose, letting the next car pass around me as I craned my neck upward. Nothing. The rest of the drive felt wrong, not dramatic wrong. Just that uncomfortable awareness like someone was standing behind you even when there wasn't. I kept checking my rearview mirror and the sky through my sunroof, expecting to see that same shadow sweep over the moon again. It didn't. By the time I pulled onto my street, my pulse had sped up without me realizing it. I parked and sat there a moment, engine idling, staring through the windshield at my quiet little block. Everything looked normal. Too normal. I turned the car off and stepped out, the night air cool against my arms. A dog barked somewhere down the road. A porch light flickered. The distant hum of traffic bled in from the main avenue. I glanced up again, squinting between rooftops. The moon shone steady and round, no trace of interference. Inside my apartment, the air felt stale, like it needed to circulate. I opened the kitchen window slightly and poured myself a glass of water, trying to shake off the weird tightness sitting high in my chest. Told myself it was probably just a passing plane or a trick of perspective. Still, I couldn't stop replaying that moment in my head. The way the shadow moved, the way the moon dimmed first. Like it knew something was about to pass in front of it. I sat on the couch and flipped on the TV mostly for background noise. Some late-night infomercial rambled on, but I barely processed a word. 10 minutes passed, maybe 15. Then the street went quiet again in that way cities only do when something's off in the rhythm. No passing cars, no music from open windows. Even the distant highway noise seemed fainter, muffled. I stood and walked over to my own window, parting the curtain just a little. The moon hung slightly higher now, glowing pale and calm. A moment later, it dimmed again. Not as much as before, but enough that my breath caught, and then the shadow returned. This time it moved slower, broader, like it stretched further across the surface, covering almost a third of the moon before gliding past and thinning into nothing. The air outside felt strangely still. The trees along the sidewalk didn't move at all, even though they'd been swaying earlier. I pressed my forehead lightly to the cool glass. There was no engine sound, no aircraft hum. No rustle of wings, just silence and that dark shape sliding across something that shouldn't be touched by anything that close. It disappeared as smoothly as it came. The moon brightened immediately. My phone vibrated in my hand where I didn't remember picking it up. The screen read 12:41 a.m. It had been 12:19 when I left my cousin's place. I didn't remember the earlier part of the drive taking that long. I stepped away from the window and walked into the hallway. Heartbeat loud and slow, like it was pacing itself. The overhead light buzzed faintly, then settled. Once more, everything quieted. The type of silence that didn't feel natural. Like the whole neighborhood paused without knowing why. Then I heard something outside, a soft scraping sound along the pavement, slow, dragging, unhurried. I leaned forward and peeked through the blinds again. No one was there. The street remained empty. Wet-looking asphalt catching pale reflection from street lamps. No stray cats, no people, no cars creeping by. Above, the moon stayed calm and ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had crossed it hadn't gone far, like it had just slipped somewhere I couldn't see anymore. After a while, the silence broke. A car passed. Someone laughed down the block. The city resumed breathing like nothing had paused at all. I shut the blinds and tried to distract myself, but every faint shadow inside my apartment felt a little heavier. Every small noise felt like it had weight behind it. When I finally lay in bed, my eyes kept drifting back to the window. I didn't pull the curtains shut. A little after 1, the moonlight slipped across my floor again, pale and steady. For a long time, nothing happened. Then the light dimmed just slightly, and a faint line slid across it, barely visible this time, like the shallowest trace of movement against something far too distant. I lay there still, watching, breathing slow, waiting to see if it would happen again. It didn't. Eventually, my eyes grew heavy. The moon returned to its normal glow. The air stayed calm. The night carried on. But the quiet felt different after that. Like it had learned how to watch back. The train had been running late all evening, that slow kind of delay that made everyone check their watch every few minutes, like it might somehow hurry things up. I sat by the window with my backpack between my feet, watching the reflection of my own tired face blur against the dark glass as the suburbs thinned out into open land. It was just past midnight. The car smelled faintly of old upholstery and hot metal, and every now and then the intercom crackled with someone mumbling about the next stop. A guy a few rows up snored with his head tipped back, and a woman across the aisle kept scrolling through her phone even though the signal had dropped to nothing miles ago. I glanced outside out of habit, expecting the usual streaks of orange and white from distant houses or passing roads. Instead, I saw a line of lights off in the distance that didn't move at all. They weren't scattered or blinking. They formed a perfectly straight horizontal line, low on the horizon, like someone had drawn it carefully with a ruler and set it just above the dark land. Each light was small and pale, almost the same color as a distant street lamp. But something about the way they lined up made my stomach tighten. The train kept rattling forward, trees whipping by close to the tracks, but those lights stayed fixed in the same spot. Not getting closer, not drifting, just sitting there, level and still. I leaned closer to the glass, trying to see if it was maybe a highway or some long stretch of parked cars. But the ground below them looked empty. No glow reflecting on the field. No sign of a road. A few seconds passed. Then more. The line of lights stayed exactly where it was, unbroken. I glanced around the car, half expecting someone else to be reacting, but everyone looked as bored and drained as before. No one seemed to notice anything strange happening outside the windows. I looked back out. The line had not shifted even a little, even though the train had definitely moved a good distance by now. The longer I watched, the more it felt wrong, like those lights were somehow independent of the world around them. They didn't belong to the land or the sky, they just existed in that one place. Then, as the train started curving slightly, the line began to slip out of view. Not because it moved, but because the angle changed. It stayed in the same spot until the last light disappeared behind the edge of the window frame. My reflection filled the glass again. Just my tired face and the faint shine of the interior lights. I leaned back into my seat, trying to let it go. Maybe it really was some distant industrial site or a weird reflection I couldn't quite place. My brain already felt foggy from the late hour and long day. A soft vibration passed through the car, stronger than the usual rumble. Most people shifted slightly in their seats. A few bags jostled on the overhead racks. I checked outside again. This time, the lights were gone completely. Just pitch-black fields and the faint outline of trees under the cloudy sky. I told myself not to think about it too much. The track ahead started running through even more isolated land, the kind of stretch that made the night feel extra quiet. No towns, no farmhouses, just darkness. 10 minutes passed, then maybe 15. I felt the sensation again. A subtle awareness, like someone standing just behind me, even though I knew no one was. I shifted forward, pretending to stretch, and glanced around. The snoring guy hadn't moved. The woman still stared at her phone. Everyone else looked drained and half asleep. I turned back to the window. The line of lights had returned. Exact same formation, same spacing, same pale color. Still low on the horizon, still perfectly straight, but now they appeared slightly closer, though the ground under them did not brighten or change at all. The train rolled onward, the trees and brush flying past. The lights did not react. They didn't shift or flicker. They stayed fixed in space, like they were pinned there. I pressed my forehead lightly against the cool glass, trying to focus hard. No sign of a road, no reflection on the ground, no obvious structure. Just that impossible straight line cutting through the night. My pulse started to pick up. I tried to look away, but my eyes kept returning to it, like my brain refused to drop the pattern. For a moment, one section of the line softened, dimmed slightly, then brightened again to its original intensity. The rest remained constant. A voice crackled over the intercom, announcing a small upcoming stop with a name I barely recognized. The train slowed. The brakes hissed. The lights outside remained frozen in place even as the car gently rolled to a near stop. I watched the line as we waited. It didn't drift, didn't respond. When the train picked back up speed, the lights slowly slipped sideways out of the frame again as the curve of the track shifted my view. They vanished without ever changing position. A heavy, nervous energy settled into me at that point, the kind that made it hard to swallow comfortably. I tried distracting myself by scrolling aimlessly on my phone, though nothing loaded. My mind kept replaying the sight of that line, how wrong it felt. A few minutes later, the train entered a shallow tunnel carved through a low ridge. The windows reflected only the interior lights and the quiet faces of passengers. When we emerged on the other side, the landscape opened into a wide stretch of flat land. The line of lights was back, farther out now, but even longer, extending across a huge portion of the horizon. Completely straight, completely still. My chest tightened. I sat very still, watching. Something about it felt too deliberate, like the lights were aware of the train moving through the darkness, aware of this exact stretch. A faint hum drifted in through a crack in the window, or maybe from somewhere deeper in the car. It didn't match the train's usual mechanical rhythm. The line didn't change, but the area around it felt subtly different, like the darkness itself had shifted tone. I checked the time on my phone. Just after 1:30 a.m., I tried to mark how long I'd been watching, but the sense of time felt slippery, as if it refused to settle. When the train finally began approaching the outskirts of the next town, small scattered lights appeared closer to the tracks, drowning out the distant horizon. The straight line faded into the general clutter of normal nighttime illumination and then vanished entirely from view. I sat there for a long moment, staring at where it had been. The train pulled into the station with its familiar screech and shudder. A few people got off. A cool breeze slipped in through the open doors. I remained seated, still uneasy but unable to explain why. The rest of the ride passed without anything else that's strange happening. Just the slow return to familiar neighborhoods and the faint glow of real streetlights drifting past in messy, human patterns. When I finally stepped off at my stop, the night air felt heavier than usual. I stood on the platform and looked out toward the dark horizon one last time. There was nothing there now. Just scattered lights and low clouds. Still, as I walked home, the image of that perfectly straight line stayed fixed in my mind, like it had never been part of the landscape at all, only waiting somewhere beyond the normal view, exactly where the train had been passing. The notification popped up on my phone at 2:17 a.m., a single line from my security app that said, "Motion detected, backyard." I only checked it because I was already half awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the pipes tick in the walls. I sat up and opened the live feed. The screen showed the usual view of my yard. Patchy grass, the old maple tree by the fence, and the corner of the shed where the paint had started peeling. Everything looked still. No raccoons, no stray cats, no person creeping around, just the faint glow from the neighbor's porch light bleeding in from the side. Then I scrubbed back a few seconds to see what triggered it. There was a soft flash. Not a bright burst, not like a camera strobe. More like the yard briefly filled with pale light, as if something had reflected off metal and bounced through the space. It lasted maybe half a second. The tree and fence glowed and then went normal again. No source, no reflection point, just sudden light and darkness. I noticed the timestamp jump from 2:16:22 to 2:17:22. Exactly 1 minute missing. I frowned at my screen, thumb hovering over the playback bar. The app had glitched before, but never like that. Usually it just stuttered or froze for a second. I rewound it again, slower this time. Same thing. Normal night, then the faint flash, then the time skipping ahead. I pushed the covers back and slipped out of bed, trying not to wake my dog, Miko, curled at the foot. My apartment was cold enough that the tile made my feet tense up when I stepped into the hallway. The backyard door was locked. I checked it anyway. Then I flicked on the porch light and peered through the glass. Nothing looked different. The grass was still wet from the earlier mist. The air outside hung heavy and cool, and the neighbor's wind chimes clinked weakly in the distance. I slid the door open a few inches. The night air rolled in, damp and quiet. No smell of smoke, no odd chemical scent, just the faint earthy smell of wet soil. I stepped out onto the concrete slab and stood there, listening. No insects, no distant traffic. Even the usual hum from the power lines near the road felt quieter than normal. I checked the yard with my phone's flashlight, sweeping it slowly across the fence line, the base of the tree, the side of the shed. The beam caught on nothing unusual. No flattened grass, no marks, no objects I didn't recognize. Still, that light bothered me. I went back inside and sat on the couch, staring at the camera feed again. It had returned to normal, timestamp advancing steadily. The yard looked boring and calm, like it had always been. Around 2:40, I noticed something else. The wind chime stopped completely. Not slowed, just stopped. The leaves on the tree didn't twitch. The faint breeze I'd felt earlier was gone. The camera view showed the yard frozen like a still photo. Then the screen flickered, not fully. Just a thin horizontal band of distortion slid across the image and vanished. I leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "Come on," I muttered. Miko lifted her head and let out a low, uncertain huff. That wasn't normal for her. She stayed quiet unless someone knocked. I glanced toward the back door again, listening. There was a faint sound outside. Not footsteps. Not quite. More like a soft shifting, almost like fabric brushing over grass, slow and steady. I held my breath and watched the screen. Nothing moved. No shadows crossed the yard. No figure passed through frame. Then the faint glow returned. This time it wasn't a flash. It hung for a second, illuminating a patch of grass near the fence about 5 feet in diameter. It didn't cast hard shadows, just a dull, pale wash of light that felt slightly out of place. The timestamp flickered again, 2:41 to 2:42:3. Another missing minute. My stomach tightened. I grabbed a hoodie and slipped my shoes on, even though every part of me said I shouldn't go back out there. I unlocked the door and stepped onto the porch again. The air felt thicker now. Not humid exactly, just heavier, like it pushed back slightly when I moved forward. I stood on the edge of the concrete, staring into the yard. The patch where the light had appeared looked normal again. The grass stood upright, glistening faintly. No scorch, no impression, no sign it had been lit up at all. But the quiet was wrong. Even when nothing happened, there was usually background noise. Crickets, traffic, air moving. This felt like being inside a paused moment. I took a slow step off the porch. The grass gave a soft crunch under my shoe, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been. I moved another step closer to the fence and waited. A low hum pulsed through the air, not loud, barely there, like a distant engine miles away, except it didn't rise or fall. It just existed, steady and flat. I glanced upward. The sky was cloudy, low sheets of gray drifting lazily over a barely visible moon. No aircraft lights, no stars. The hum faded and the air went dead still again. I backed up toward the porch, unease settling deeper in my bones. Inside, I checked the camera once more. The feed had stabilized. No glow, no flicker, just the yard as it always looked. I didn't sleep much after that. Every tiny sound made me shift my eyes toward the back door. Miko refused to leave my side. By morning, the sky had turned pale and hazy, the kind of gray that made everything feel muted. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee and looked around for anything out of place. The yard looked entirely ordinary. No marks, no dents, no broken plants, not even disturbed dirt. I pulled up the recording again on my phone as I stood there. The flashes and skipped minutes remained. Everything in between showed the yard waiting, empty and unbothered. Around 9:30, I noticed the maple tree casting an odd shadow line across the lawn, perfectly straight, sharper than the others. It slowly softened as the sun shifted, then disappeared. I told myself it was just the angle of light. Still, I left the camera app open all day. Nothing else happened. No alerts, no strange flashes. By evening, I almost convinced myself the whole thing had been a system glitch mixed with poor sleep. But when I checked the yard one last time before bed, I noticed the grass near the fence swayed slightly, even though the rest of the yard remained still. No wind, no sound. Just that small patch moving slowly, like something had passed through it moments before. I watched it for a long time until it stilled again. The camera stayed silent through the night after that. No more flashes, no skipped time. But every time I glanced at the dark window, I had the uneasy sense that something had already figured out how my yard looked from above and was deciding when to come back. I heard the gravel crunch behind me before I even realized how quiet everything had gotten. It was one of those early fall evenings where the air felt a little damp and cool, but not cold yet, and I had taken my usual walking path through the wooded trail behind the old neighborhood near Lake Morel. I lived a few blocks away in a small rental with peeling paint and a fence that leaned slightly, and most nights I walked the same loop just to clear my head after work. My name is Travis, and I worked maintenance at a community college. Nothing weird ever happened on that trail before. Kids rode bikes there during the day. Dog walkers used it in the mornings. It felt normal, familiar. So when I heard footsteps crunching close behind me, steady and paced like someone matching my stride, I figured it was a jogger or another walker coming up from behind. I shifted a little to the right side of the path to make room. The footsteps didn't pass me, they stayed right behind. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Each step landed about a second after mine, too perfect to be random. I slowed down slightly, expecting whoever it was to either slow to or come around me. The sound kept pace, same distance. That tight feeling started creeping into my chest, the kind where your body reacts before your brain catches up. I stopped completely. The footsteps stopped too. I waited. No voice, no cough, no shuffle of someone adjusting their bag or phone. Just absolute quiet. I looked over my shoulder. There was no one there. The trail behind me curved slightly and dipped into a thicker patch of trees, but I could clearly see 5 or 6 yards back. Empty path. No movement. No rustle. I stood there for a few seconds, listening. My heart picked up. The air felt heavier, almost like the humidity had thickened around me. I let out a slow breath and told myself it was just someone stepping off the path or cutting through the woods. Still, I stayed still, watching the trees. That's when I noticed a faint glow. It wasn't bright, not even sharp. Just a dim, soft light moving between the trunks, low to the ground and drifting away from the path. Almost like someone carrying a covered lantern deeper into the woods. It moved slowly and smoothly, too smooth for a flashlight beam. No shaking, no sway. I stared at it, trying to find the source. No silhouette, no outline of a person. Just the light itself sliding away and fading as it went. Then it disappeared completely. The woods went dark again. Not normal dark, just flat shadow. I swallowed and turned forward, telling myself to just keep walking and not overthink it. As I started moving again, my pulse still felt uneven. The trail ahead looked the same as always, narrow and cracked in places, scattered with dry leaves and small stones. After about 30 seconds, I heard it again. Crunch, crunch, footsteps, same distance, same rhythm. I didn't even want to turn this time. I just kept walking, every sense tuned toward the sound behind me. Each step felt louder now, like the gravel wanted to announce itself. I glanced to my right, into the trees, searching for that glow again, but everything stayed dark. The path curved uphill slightly, and the tree line grew tighter. The air felt strangely still, like even the usual night breeze had backed off. The footsteps stayed perfectly matched to mine. I finally forced myself to turn around slowly. Nothing. The trail behind me looked deserted. No shapes, no outline of anyone stepping off, no hint of movement. But right as I started to turn forward again, that soft glow flickered once more behind a cluster of trees to the left. Not bright enough to light anything around it, just its own dull presence. It slid along the ground a few feet, then slowly dimmed. I stopped again, staring toward that spot. My phone buzzed in my pocket suddenly, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I pulled it out, half relieved to see a normal notification. It was just a text from my sister asking if I'd fed her cat yet. The screen light lit my hands and the trail right in front of me. When I looked back toward the trees, the glow was gone. I checked the time. 8:47 p.m. Still early enough that something like this shouldn't feel so intense, but everything about the trail felt wrong now. I decided to head back toward the street where the porch lights and passing cars were. I turned around and started walking the opposite direction, quickening my pace. After 3 steps, the crunching came back. Behind me. Again. Closer this time. My shoulders tensed and my grip on my phone tightened. I didn't run. I don't know why. Maybe some stubborn instinct told me not to look afraid, but every step felt heavier, like I was walking through thick air. Crunch, crunch. Then nothing. Silence again. No birds, no wind, no trees shifting. just the distant hum of traffic somewhere far off and the faint ringing in my own ears. I turned slowly. No one, just that empty path and dim woods. This time, the glow appeared ahead of me instead of behind. It hovered near the tree line about 15 feet off the trail, faint and pale, not round or defined. Just a soft blur of light that didn't match anything natural. It hung there for a few seconds, unmoving, like it was observing the path. Then it began drifting sideways, sliding behind one trunk, then another, still smooth and soundless. I stood frozen, my eyes locked on it, trying to process what I was actually seeing. It didn't illuminate the leaves, it didn't cast shadows, it just existed. My skin prickled all over. After a moment, the glow dimmed until it blended into the blackness and vanished. The woods returned to their normal look, but the feeling hadn't changed. If anything, it felt heavier now, like something lingered just beyond sight. I took a few steps backward, then turned and walked quickly toward the edge of the trail where the trees thinned. The sound of the gravel shifted as I moved faster, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard another set of footsteps again, but they faded quickly. When the first street lamp came into view, throwing a yellow patch of light onto the sidewalk, I felt my chest loosen slightly. The instant I stepped off the trail and onto pavement, the air didn't feel as dense anymore. Normal night sounds returned, a dog barking, a car door slamming somewhere, wind brushing through leaves. I glanced back at the entrance to the trail. It looked completely ordinary. No glow, no movement, just a dark stretch of trees that felt like it had swallowed something and wasn't giving it back. I walked the rest of the way home without stopping once, my mind replaying the timing of those footsteps and how they had mirrored my own. When I reached my house, I stood on the porch a moment, keys still in hand, listening to the familiar creak of the old siding and the hum of the streetlight overhead. Everything felt normal again, almost too normal. But when I looked down at my shoes, I noticed small bits of gravel clinging to the soles more than usual, like I'd been standing in that same spot longer than I remembered. I brushed it off, unlocked the door, and went inside. The house smelled like detergent and dust and the faint scent of my sister's cat food. Still safe. Still real. Outside the window, the tree line sat motionless, the trail hidden in darkness. And for a long time that night, I kept expecting to hear those steady footsteps crunching up my driveway, matching my own every step just out of view. The light in the sky had been drifting so slowly, I almost missed it at first. I stood on the rocky edge of the breakwater behind my cousin's small coastal cabin, hands in my pockets, staring out at the water like I did most mornings. A heavy fog hung low over the bay, the kind that muted sound and made everything feel farther away than it was. The tide rolled in steady and slow, soft enough that I could hear each wave break against the rocks. My name is Mateo Rivas, and I had driven down to this stretch of the Oregon coast to get out of town for a few days. No crowds, no traffic, just salt air and quiet. That pale dot in the sky sat way above the fog line, dull but clear enough to see. It moved like a distant plane might, slow and steady, but there was no blinking, no trail, none of that familiar shape, just a faint white point sliding across the washed-out blue-gray sky. I watched it for a solid mid-minute without really thinking much of it. Then it stopped, not slowed, not shifted direction. It just froze in place. I stood there waiting for it to move again, expecting it would slide on after a few seconds. It didn't. It stayed perfectly still, like it had been pinned there. I checked my position, tilted my head, even stepped a few feet to the side to make sure it wasn't some trick of perspective. The light didn't budge. A breeze kicked up off the water, cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of kelp and wet wood. Seabirds circled lower down, calling out like normal. Everything else felt ordinary, which somehow made the empty stillness of that light more noticeable. I pulled out my phone and zoomed in on it, but the image just blurred into a fuzzy speck that looked even less real on the screen. When I lowered the phone, it was still there, motionless. Minutes passed. I knew they did because I checked the time twice. Still no movement. The fog shifted along the shoreline, wrapping the base of the lighthouse in a soft haze. Waves rolled, the world moved, that light stayed fixed in place. A strange tension crept into my shoulders. Not panic, just a slow awareness that something about this didn't line up. Then, without warning, the light dimmed. It didn't blink out. It faded like someone turning down a dimmer switch, softer and softer until the sky looked empty again. I kept staring at that patch of space long after it disappeared, expecting it to reappear or shift or do anything to explain itself. It didn't. I stayed outside another 10 minutes, pretending I was just enjoying the view, but my eyes kept drifting back to the same spot. Nothing changed. I eventually headed inside, the old screen door creaking behind me as I stepped into the cabin. The wood floors felt cool under my boots, and the smell of old pine mixed with leftover coffee reminded me I was still somewhere normal. I told myself it was probably a satellite or some weird reflection. That explanation felt thin, but I tried to let it sit. A few hours later, as the fog started thinning and weak sunlight filtered through the windows, I walked down the narrow gravel road toward the small general store at the edge of the cove. The same stretch of sky looked plain now, soft blue with faint streaks of cloud. Nothing out of place. Inside the store, a guy named Harold, who lived further down the coast, chatted with the cashier, Marlene, about the weather shifting early this year. I grabbed a bottle of water and let their voices fade into background noise. Normal conversation. Normal morning. Still, something about that frozen light stuck with me. On my way back, I noticed another strange thing. The gulls that usually hung out along the fence line were gone. Not scattered, not moved further down the beach, just absent. The air near the cliff felt heavier too, almost like it pressed against my ears. No wind, no sound. I looked up again, half expecting to see that light waiting there. Nothing. I forced out a quiet breath and kept walking. Gravel crunched under my boots, the sound sharp in the dead air. Each step felt oddly deliberate, like the stretch of road itself had gone tense. When I reached the cabin, I paused before opening the door and glanced back toward the water. A faint glimmer flickered briefly above the horizon, so subtle I almost convinced myself it was sunlight catching mist. But it faded before I could focus on it. Inside, I tried to distract myself. I rinsed a cup, flipped through an old paperback, checked for signal on my phone, even though coverage out there barely existed. Everything felt slightly off, like the quiet was a little too clean. Around noon, I stepped back onto the porch to get some air. The fog had mostly burned away now, leaving the ocean looking flat and pale under an overcast sky. That's when I saw it again, higher this time. A pale point of light gliding slowly across the clouds, almost identical to the one I'd seen earlier. My stomach tightened. I watched as it moved, steady and smooth, just like before. No flicker, no shape, just that soft glow drifting across open sky. And then it stopped again, right in the middle of the cloud cover. I stood still, barely breathing, eyes locked on it. The light hung there, silent and unmoving, like it didn't belong to anything that followed normal rules. The world below it kept going. A small boat cut across the distance. Wind brushed the tall grass along the edge of the cliff. The ocean shifted. That point stayed fixed. I checked my watch again. Time moved. The light didn't. I started feeling watched, though there was no direction to it. Just a heavy sense of presence that made my skin prickle. A minute passed, then another. The light didn't flicker this time. It simply dimmed and seemed to dissolve straight into the color of the sky. Not dropping, not drifting away, just fading until it wasn't there anymore. The clouds closed around that space like nothing ever happened. I stayed on the porch longer than I meant to, waiting for any hint of movement, any return. The sky stayed empty. Eventually, the tension eased just enough that I stepped back inside. The familiar creak of the floorboards grounded me slightly. The hum of the fridge filled the silence the way white noise fills a room. By late afternoon, everything looked normal again. Waves rolled in, birds returned to the shore, wind moved through the grass. But every time I glanced upward, my eyes hunted for that same still spot in the sky. Nothing appeared. As evening rolled in and the horizon darkened, I locked the door and pulled the thin curtains shut. The cabin settled into its usual quiet rhythm, wood popping softly as the temperature cooled. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying the way that light had just stopped, like gravity and motion had agreed to forget it for a while. At some point, the sense of unease dulled enough for me to sit up and look out the window one last time. The sky looked normal, empty. No motion, no glow, just a stretch of dark clouds rolling slowly across the same space where something impossible had lingered far too long before fading away. The vibration rolled through the car so lightly at first, I thought it was just the engine settling. I had been parked at a small pull-off just outside Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, killing time before heading the rest of the way home. The sun had dropped behind the low hills, and the air still felt thick with leftover heat from the day. The asphalt shimmered faintly, like it hadn't let go of the warmth yet. My name is Darren Cole, and I'd pulled over because my head felt full after driving for hours. The town lights were far off, barely visible, and the desert around me looked flat and endless. No other cars, no wind, just quiet. Then that faint tremor passed through the steering wheel and the seat beneath me. It wasn't sharp. It was more like the sensation you get when a semi rolls by, except nothing moved on the road. No headlights, no sound, just that dull vibration, humming, almost, lasting a few seconds before fading. I sat there listening, waiting for it to happen again. Outside, the horizon had turned a dusty purple, the last of the daylight thinning out. That's when I noticed the glow. Low and far off, just above the silhouette of the hills, a soft, pale light drifted from left to right. It looked too smooth to be a plane and too silent to be anything I recognized. It didn't brighten the ground in front of it. It just hovered there, steady. I leaned forward instinctively, gripping the wheel like I needed to ground myself. The vibration came back, a little stronger this time, like something heavy passed nearby even though the road remained empty. The light kept gliding, slow and calm, as if it had its own path no one else could see. I cracked the window, expecting to hear something, but the air was still and dry. No engine noise, no wind, just quiet and that faint glow moving along the horizon. After maybe a minute, the light paused. Not slowed, just stopped. It sat there, unmoving, the way a star might hang in the sky, except this was far too low for that. I watched it, jaw tight, eyes burning from not blinking. The vibration stopped too. Everything went still. I checked my mirrors, half expecting to spot another car or some source behind me. Nothing. Empty road in every direction. A strange pressure filled the space around the car, like my ears wanted to pop, but never quite did. My phone screen lit up with a notification and then faded again. The time read 8:17 p.m. I kept staring at that pale dot, trying to make sense of it. Was it someone using a drone? A weird reflection off distant glass? Even those explanations didn't sit right. The glow slowly brightened, not harsh, just steady enough to make my skin feel tight. And then it started moving again, gliding in the opposite direction this time, slower, like it was reconsidering where it wanted to go. As it moved, the faint vibration returned, but softer, softer, like a distant heartbeat I could feel in the floor of the car. I opened the door partway and stepped out, boots hitting warm gravel. The air smelled like dust and sage. No sound of insects. No breeze. The glow slid just above the line where land met sky. It never rose, never dipped, just floated. Something about it made me feel watched, even though it barely felt aware of anything at all. A memory hit me suddenly, of my older brother Jonah telling me about strange lights he swore he saw once near Alamogordo when we were younger. I'd laughed it off back then. Standing there, staring at this thing, I didn't feel like laughing. The light paused again, almost like it sensed I was paying attention. I stayed still, afraid that movement would change whatever was happening. Minutes dragged by. The air felt heavier somehow, pressing down without actually weighing anything. The desert around me should have been alive with small sounds, but it felt muted, like the world had been turned down a notch. Then slowly the glow began to fade, not blinking out, just dimming, thinning, blending into the horizon until the outline vanished completely. The landscape returned to its plain, dark shape, like nothing had happened. And just as quietly as it arrived, the vibration stopped again. I stood there another few minutes, staring at the same empty stretch of desert, waiting for the light to come back, or for the rumble to return. Nothing did. Eventually, I slid back into the car and shut the door, the quiet clicking sealing me in. The air inside felt too still. I turned the key in the ignition just to hear something familiar, the low engine idle settling around me. The radio came on softly, static and a faint country song from somewhere miles away. I turned it off almost immediately. I didn't want anything layered on top of what I'd just heard and felt. I sat there longer than I meant to, eyes flicking between the horizon and the dashboard. The time ticked forward normally. No jumps, No odd behavior. After maybe 10 minutes, I finally pulled back onto the road, headlights cutting through the dark as I headed out. The drive home felt normal enough. Traffic picked up near the outskirts of town. Streetlights steadied my nerves slightly. Still, every time the road curved and the land stretched open again, I found myself scanning the horizon, searching for that soft, pale glow. It never returned. Later that night, lying in my own bed with the fan humming and the distant sound of my neighbor's dog barking, I replayed that moment again and again. The way the vibration passed through the car. The way the light just paused like motion didn't matter to it. No explanation ever felt right. Not drones. Not planes. Not anything familiar. All I knew for certain was that for a few minutes out there in the quiet desert, something had moved across the horizon that didn't seem to follow the same rules as everything else around it. And then it left, quietly, without leaving anything behind. I was halfway down Brookline Drive when every dog started barking at once. Not just one or two. Every house along the street. Sharp, frantic barking that cut through the quiet like an alarm. I stopped mid-step and looked around, expecting to see someone running or a coyote crossing the yards, but nothing moved. The streetlights glowed their usual soft yellow, and the sky above looked clear and dark. My name is Elise Morrow, and I'd gone out for a late walk because sleep wasn't happening. The air felt cool and damp, like it was going to rain later, and the pavement still held a little warmth from the afternoon. Normal night. Normal neighborhood. Except now every dog was losing it, all aimed in the same direction. I followed their line of noise and tilt, and that's when I looked up. Nothing stood out at first, just the stretch of dark sky over the rooftops. But then I noticed a slight imbalance, like my eyes weren't settling right. I focused harder and saw it, a faint, pale point hovering way higher than any drone or plane I'd ever seen. It didn't blink, it didn't move. It just sat there. The dogs kept barking, rising and falling like waves, some howling now, some whining. I felt stupid standing in the middle of the sidewalk staring up, but I couldn't make myself keep walking. A breeze should have been moving through the trees, but the leaves barely stirred. The air felt dense, like something thick was pressing down without touching me. I checked my phone to see the time, 10:41 p.m. No missed calls, no alerts. I tilted the screen upward out of habit, trying to see if it would catch anything. Nothing showed. The light above stayed steady, too clean and round to be a star. It wasn't casting a beam or flaring, just existing. Across the street, old Mr. Redford's German Shepherd slammed against his fence, barking so hard I thought it might break through. Other neighbors' porch lights flicked on and off, a few curtains shifting as people looked out. No one stepped outside. The glow pulsed once, barely noticeable, but enough to make my stomach tighten, and then it drifted an inch to the right. So slow, I almost thought I imagined it. I started walking again, not wanting to feel frozen out there. As I moved, the glow shifted too, keeping almost the same position relative to me, like it was tracking without trying to be obvious. Each step felt heavier, like the ground had softened into something thick. My breathing felt louder than usual in my ears. The dogs kept their focus locked on that spot. Even as I moved farther down the block, their barking followed the same point in the sky. Halfway toward the intersection, I realized the usual night sounds were missing. No insects, no distant cars, just barking and the soft scuff of my shoes. The pale light shuddered once, like a ripple went through it, then went completely still again. I stopped near the glazed windows of the corner house and watched it. My reflection looked pale, almost washed out. "Okay," I muttered under my breath, not knowing who I was talking to. Suddenly, the barking cut off. Every single dog at the exact same moment fell silent. The quiet that followed felt wrong, like someone had reached into the air and pulled a plug. I stood frozen, staring up. The glow brightened slightly, not blinding, but enough to make the surrounding stars fade around it. I could feel a faint pressure behind my ears, the kind you get when driving through altitude changes, except I hadn't moved. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. I pulled it out. The screen lit up, but there was no notification. The time now read 10:42 p.m. It shouldn't have felt like more than a minute had passed. The light slid a few inches higher in the sky, smooth and controlled. Still no sound. No trail. No flicker except that faint, steady pulse. A low noise drifted through the air then, something almost like distant wind but not tied to any direction. It made the windows along the houses vibrate just slightly. I could feel it through the soles of my shoes. Then the dogs started again. Faster, more frantic, a different kind of bark, like fear instead of warning. The glow dimmed abruptly, then brightened again, like someone adjusting a dimmer switch. It sank just a little, then hovered in place, trembling faintly. I backed up a few steps without realizing it, my back brushing a cold brick wall. My heart thudded so hard I could feel it in my throat. A shape shifted around the glow, like a distortion, but nothing solid enough to identify. Just a suggestion of movement around something that didn't want to be seen clearly. The pressure in the air grew heavier. I felt watched, not in a human way, but in a way that felt wider, distant, indifferent. The glow began drifting slowly toward the tree line beyond the last row of houses. As it moved, the barking followed, dogs tracking it with strange precision. Their bodies pressed against doors and fences, eyes lifted, whining and snapping. I started walking too, not to follow it, just trying to get myself home faster. Every few steps I glanced up, terrified it would vanish and even more unsettled if it didn't. It reached the edge of the neighborhood and hovered there, above the brush and dark outline of trees, another pulse, stronger this time. My streetlight flickered overhead, the dogs went silent again, and then, without any hint of motion, the glow thinned and slipped upward, fading until it blended completely into the night sky. Nothing replaced it. No stars filled the gap right away, just empty darkness. I stood there, breathing shallow, waiting for any sign it might return. The dogs hesitated, whining softly, confused without their target. Slowly, one by one, they retreated back to their yards and porches. Normal neighborhood sounds crept back in. A car passed several streets over. A breeze finally stirred the leaves. I walked the rest of the way home mechanically, keys tight in my hand, eyes still flicking toward the sky every few seconds. Inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, listening to the quiet. My phone showed 10:44 p.m. Only 3 minutes had passed since I first looked up. From my kitchen window, I scanned the sky again. Nothing unusual, just ordinary darkness and familiar stars. Still, the longer I stood there, the more I felt like something had moved through my street without ever truly belonging to the night. And the dogs knew long before I did. A low humming tone pulsed quietly through the open window beside my bed, soft enough that, at first, I thought it was the refrigerator downstairs or the old heater rattling awake. I'd left the window cracked because the air inside the cabin felt stale, even though the night outside was cool and damp. The sound didn't fade or change like normal background noise. It stayed steady, like a slow heartbeat from somewhere beyond the trees. I pushed myself up and glanced toward the shoreline. The ocean was barely visible, just a flat, dark stretch under a cloudy sky. The stars above looked off. Not brighter or dimmer, just slightly misaligned, like the pattern had been nudged out of place. I stared for a few seconds, expecting my eyes to adjust. They didn't. My name was Jonah Mercer, and I'd been staying at this rented coastal cabin for 2 nights, trying to clear my head after a long stretch of work. The place was quiet, isolated, and exactly what I needed, until that sound started moving through the air. I checked my phone. 1:42 a.m., no notifications, no missed calls. The hum deepened, not louder, just more present, like it filled the air rather than traveling through it. I swung my legs out of bed and padded across the wooden floor, bare feet brushing past cold knots in the planks. The sound felt closer by the time I reached the window. Outside, the trees along the edge of the property held perfectly still. No wind, no rustle. Even the waves seemed muted. I leaned forward and scanned the sky again. The stars didn't twinkle the way they usually did. A few of them looked slightly closer together, forming crooked lines that didn't match any constellation I recognized. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, just enough to not feel right. The humming shifted slightly, like it pulsed in waves. Slow, patient. I stepped outside onto the porch, the wood cool under my feet. The night air felt heavier than before, thick with salt and damp earth. I walked across the gravel path toward the edge of the clearing, eyes never leaving the sky. A faint glow started to bleed through the clouds, right above the tree line. It wasn't sharp or blinding, just a soft, pale light like moonlight diffused through fog, except the moon was nowhere in sight. The hum synced with it, each faint vibrational pulse matching the glow's slow rhythm. I stood there, arms hanging uselessly at my sides, trying to convince myself it was just some weird reflection off the water or distant boat lights. But it didn't move like boats. It didn't flicker. It stayed locked in place. Then slowly the glow slid sideways, perfectly smooth. No sound, no trail, just a calm, deliberate drift. The stars above it shifted further out of alignment, like the sky itself adjusted around that one spot. A sharp unease crept into my chest. Not panic, just a heavy awareness that something wasn't behaving the way it should. The hum grew slightly stronger, enough that I felt it faintly through the soles of my feet. The ground didn't shake, just a mild vibration, like standing near a distant engine. I pulled my phone out again and raised it toward the light, half instinct, half confusion. The screen dimmed abruptly, and the signal dropped to zero. No bars, no data, just a blank carrier field. The glow pulsed once, faint but noticeable. The air felt colder suddenly, even though I hadn't moved. I stepped back without thinking, heels scraping against gravel. The hum didn't follow me. It stayed anchored to wherever that light hovered, as if it had claimed that space. Another minute passed, maybe several. Time felt stretched, loose. The glow shifted again, this time rising slightly above the trees, then freezing in place. The stars around it distorted subtly, lines bending in ways I couldn't quite focus on long enough to understand. I whispered something under my breath, more out of nerves than intention. The sound felt swallowed by the night. Behind me, the cabin door creaked faintly, as it caught a tiny movement in air I didn't feel. I turned my head briefly just to check the house, then looked back up. The glow had dimmed, shrinking slightly, but the hum intensified for a few seconds, vibrating through my jaw and ears. It wasn't painful, just intrusive. The sky cleared around it for a moment, and I could make out something darker within the glow. A smooth shape, no sharp edges, like a shadow against light that refused to resolve into anything familiar. The thought crossed my mind that I should go inside, lock the door, pretend I didn't see anything. I didn't move. The glow drifted again, higher this time, slowly approaching the thin clouds above. The hum began to thin, as if pulling away from the ground. The stars reconfigured slightly, snapping back closer to how they should have looked, but not quite perfect. I took a few cautious steps backward toward the porch. The glow suddenly steadied, holding still for several long seconds. Then, without sound or flare, it faded. Not abruptly. Just slowly draining out of the sky until there was nothing but dark and uneven star patterns. The hum lingered for a moment longer, faint and hollow, before dissolving into the quiet night. Silence returned in pieces. Distant wave crash, a bird settling somewhere in the trees, the faint flutter of leaves. I stood out there a few minutes longer, heart beating too fast for how still everything felt. When I finally went back inside and shut the door, the air didn't feel heavy anymore, just normal again. Dim, uneventful. I checked my phone. Signal bars returned. The time read 2:01 a.m. I stared at the clock, realizing I could have sworn it had only been a few minutes since I'd looked last. The room felt colder than before. I climbed back into bed but couldn't fully relax. Every small sound made me tense. Every faint creak in the wood drew my attention toward the window again. The stars outside looked ordinary now, this familiar. But every so often, in the space just behind my thoughts, I kept sensing that quiet hum, like a memory echo. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the sky had briefly shifted and then carefully put itself back the way it found me. Condensation formed a perfect ring on my windshield while I was sitting in the grocery store parking lot, engine off, windows cracked just enough to let the late summer air drift in. It was still warm out, no sudden chill, no foggy breath, just this smooth, clear circle of moisture like someone had pressed a cold metal hoop against the glass. It caught my eye because it didn't look natural. Not streaked, not patchy, just a ring. My name was Darren Kovach, and I'd pulled over in the far corner of the lot to answer a call from my cousin Mateo. The sun was low and washed everything in dull orange light, the kind that made the asphalt look soft and dusty. There were a few cars going in and out, nothing strange about the place, except that ring. I rubbed at it with my sleeve. It didn't smear. It just faded and then crept back into shape, like the glass remembered it. I checked my dashboard temperature out of instinct. 78 degrees. Normal, same as when I'd parked. Mateo was still talking on the phone, rambling about his new job and some forklift accident at work. I half listened, eyes stuck on the windshield, watching the ring slowly sharpen again. No mist anywhere else, just that circle, centered slightly to the right of where my gaze would normally rest while driving. "You okay?" Mateo asked. "Yeah, just distracted," I said. "Weird windshield thing." He laughed and kept talking, but my stomach had tightened in that quiet way it does when something feels off, but you don't know why yet. Another car rolled past behind me, a pale blue Prius. Sunlight reflecting cleanly off its side windows. No fog, no rings, just normal glass. My phone crackled and Mateo's voice cut out. The screen flashed, "Call failed." I looked up to reconnect and noticed the ring on the windshield had deepened, thicker now, with tiny lines branching inward like frost patterns, but without the cold. The air inside my car still felt warm and dry. I rolled my window down more, letting the outside heat rush in, just to see if anything shifted. Nothing changed. The ring stayed. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, heading toward Route 6 like I'd planned. As the car moved, the ring moved with the glass, staying perfectly centered, almost like it wanted to be in front of me. No other cars had anything like it. At the stoplight, I leaned forward to study it closer. It had a slight shimmer, like condensation about to evaporate, but it never did. Around it, the rest of the windshield stayed perfectly clear. The light turned green. I drove on. It felt stupid to be unsettled by something as simple as fog, but this didn't behave like fog. It looked deliberate, measured, meant. Heading out of town, houses thinned into low fields and distant tree lines. The sky turned from orange to soft gray as the sun dipped lower. A faint layer of clouds rolled in from the west, nothing threatening, just heavy enough to dull the horizon. The ring pulsed once, barely noticeable, a subtle darkening and lightening. I blinked, convinced my eyes were tired. It stayed the same. A few miles down the highway, my phone buzzed with a text from Mateo. "Call me back." I tapped the screen, but the signal bars dropped to 0. No service. That didn't make sense. This stretch of road always had coverage. I crested a slight hill and glanced ahead, half expecting something to cause all this. The road stretched empty, quiet, just me and fields on either side. Then I noticed another patch of condensation forming, faintly near the far edge of the windshield. Not a full circle, just a soft arc like the edge of another ring that never fully appeared. A low, distant hum drifted into the car. It wasn't coming from the engine or the road beneath me. It felt like pressure, more than sound, vibrating faintly through the steering wheel. I checked my mirrors. No cars behind me, no trucks. Just open road and fading light. The original ring thickened again, clearer now, and I realized it wasn't quite round. It was too precise, too smooth. My breathing felt shallow without me trying. The hum grew slightly stronger. Not loud, just present. I pulled over onto the narrow gravel shoulder, tires crunching softly as I stopped. The car idled, the hum didn't change. The ring sat there, calm, as if waiting. I opened the door and stepped out. The evening air hit me full force, warm and still. No breeze, no insects, just quiet. Standing beside the car, I expected the condensation to whiten or vanish, but it looked the same from the outside. A faint, perfect halo on the glass. Still no sign of fog anywhere else. I took a few hesitant steps around the front bumper, scanning the windshield from different angles. Sunlight barely kissed the horizon behind me, throwing long shadows across the field. And then I noticed something odd. The ring didn't reflect the sky the same way the rest of the glass did. Through that circle, the sky looked slightly darker, like it filtered light instead of reflecting it. The hum deepened, subtle, slow, like the low note of something massive moving far away. I checked the field ahead, searching for any source. Nothing moved. No power lines nearby, no towers. The condensation around the ring began to creep outward just a little, thin veins forming like frost about to spread. But the temperature hadn't changed. My breath didn't show. My arms didn't feel cold. I stepped back, suddenly uncomfortable being so close to it. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. Still no signal. Time read 7:12 p.m. I glanced back up at the windshield. The ring had shifted. Not dramatically, but enough to know it was no longer centered where it had been before. It had slid slightly upward, as if following my line of sight. My skin prickled. The hum grew fainter, thinning like sound drifting away. And then something else caught my attention. A faint glow just above the horizon, far out past the fields. Soft, pale, almost like a reflection of the dying sun, except the sun was behind me now. The glow didn't flicker. It didn't break into pieces. It just hovered low, steady and quiet. The ring responded. It tightened, edges sharpening, condensation drawing itself into a clearer outline. The veins receded, leaving only the circle again, more defined than before. I stood there, frozen, watching the distant glow hold perfectly still while the sky slowly dimmed around it. Another soft vibration rippled through the ground beneath my boots. No birds, no wind. I forced myself back into the driver's seat and shut the door. The inside of the car felt heavier now, like the air had thickened. I stared through the ring at the glow on the horizon. The two lined up unnervingly well, as if the ring framed it. Several seconds passed, maybe longer. My sense of time felt slow and stretched. Then the glow shifted sideways, smooth and silent. The ring followed, not sliding across the glass like liquid, but reforming in that new position, as though it had always been meant to sit there. The hum returned, softer but steady. I gripped the steering wheel and swallowed hard, pulse loud in my ears. Fear didn't rush me all at once. It crept in heavy and slow, filling the space behind my ribs. The glow drifted farther left. The ring adjusted again. I finally started the car and pulled back onto the road, heart thudding. As I drove, the glow kept the same distance, never getting closer or farther, just pacing me along the horizon. The ring remained steady in front of my eyes, like a sighting target I couldn't escape. Mile after mile passed in swallowed silence. No radio, no service. Just the road and that quiet light. After what felt like forever, the glow diminished slightly, then again, until it thinned into barely visible haze. The ring on the windshield softened and finally dissolved as well, vanishing without streaks or residue. The hum faded with it. I slowed the car, breathing harder than I realized, watching the last hint of light melt into the darkening sky. Nothing replaced it. No sudden normal noise, just distant crickets returning and the soft rush of tires on asphalt. By the time I reached the edge of town again, my phone signal returned like nothing had happened. A missed call from Mateo. A few regular notifications. The windshield stayed clear the rest of the drive. But every time the glass caught the last traces of sunlight just right, I could almost swear I saw the faint outline of a circle trying to reappear, as if the surface remembered something it wasn't supposed to hold. My shadow stretched out across the cracked sidewalk in front of me, suddenly twice as long as it should have been, even though the streetlight above hadn't flickered or shifted. It looked warped, like it belonged to someone taller, someone standing at a different angle. I slowed to a stop and stared down at it, waiting for the light to change or for a car to pass and mess with the darkness. Nothing happened. After a few seconds, the shadow slid back into its normal shape, neat and predictable again. I stood there for a minute, half expecting it to stretch again. It didn't. The street stayed quiet. My name was Elise Navarro, and I'd been walking home from my sister Maribel's place a few blocks over. It was late but still warm, that thick summer night kind of warm that clung to everything. The sky was clear, and the neighborhood was half asleep, a few porch lights on, the occasional TV flickering behind curtains. I kept walking, trying to shake the weird feeling that followed that little moment. The light above hadn't moved. I'd checked twice. No wind, no passing cars, no reason for the shadow to behave like that. A dog barked a few houses down, sharp and sudden, then went quiet again. I glanced around, scanning the empty road and the dark driveways. Everything looked normal. 2 blocks later, I felt it again. Not the shadow this time, but that sense that something around me was slightly off. Like the air felt heavier, almost pressed closer to my skin. I slowed down unconsciously, my footfalls softer against the pavement. My shadow shifted strangely again, just a little, stretching sideways longer than my actual body should have allowed. I turned my head toward the streetlight, still steady, still bright, same angle. I raised my hand and watched the movement below. The shadow lagged by the tiniest fraction of a second before matching my hand. That unsettled me more than the length change. It felt like it wasn't completely synced with me. A faint buzzing noise hummed from somewhere nearby, too low to place. I thought maybe it was a transformer or some electrical box hidden in someone's yard, but it didn't pulse, the way those usually did. It was smooth, continuous. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no new messages. The time read 10:28 p.m. As I moved forward, the hum faded. The air felt lighter again, but the quiet pressed in. No crickets, no wind, just footsteps and distant traffic far away. When I reached the corner near the small neighborhood park, I noticed the shadow misbehaving again. Longer, too sharp. It stretched toward the grass like it wanted to slip off the pavement. A distant light glowed faintly beyond the park, near the line of trees. It wasn't one of the usual lampposts. It was lower, softer, pale. It hovered just beyond the branches, but barely noticeable unless you focused on it. I stopped again and stared toward it. The light didn't flicker or move. It didn't cast a beam. It just sat there quietly. My shadow darkened suddenly, as if something briefly passed between me and the streetlight. I looked up instinctively, expecting to see a bird or maybe a drone. Nothing was there, just empty night sky. The glow near the trees dimmed slightly, then returned to its earlier brightness. The buzzing reappeared, sharper now, a faint vibration that seemed to travel through the ground instead of the air. I shifted my weight, feeling the soles of my shoes faintly humming. I took a hesitant step toward the park entrance. The shadow snapped back into perfect alignment, normal length, normal shape. For a second, everything looked ordinary again. Then the glow moved. It drifted a few feet to the right, smooth and steady, as if sliding on invisible rails. The trees didn't sway around it. Leaves didn't react. The light just repositioned itself. I whispered, "Nope," under my breath, but didn't turn around yet. Another step forward. The hum deepened. The glow paused. My shadow stretched again, unnaturally long, pointing straight toward the light now. I suddenly felt watched, not by someone behind me, not by a pair of eyes, just a general awareness that something had noticed me standing there. I hesitated, heart starting to thud harder than it should for a normal evening walk. The glow thinned, almost shrinking, then expanded again. It didn't brighten or dim dramatically, just shifted subtly, like it was adjusting. The streetlight overhead flickered once, not fully off, just a small stutter of brightness. When it steadied, my shadow snapped briefly sideways, then corrected itself. I backed up a step without breaking eye contact with the tree line. The hum weakened slightly, but didn't vanish. The glow remained. A car passed somewhere far behind me, its headlights washing faintly across nearby house fronts. My shadow exploded into weird, overlapping shapes for a second, then returned to its elongated form. The glow lowered a little, sinking closer to the trees, partially obscured by branches now. The air felt cold suddenly, damp against my arms despite the earlier warmth. The buzzing softened until it was barely there. Another long moment passed. Then another. Slowly, the glow slid sideways again, deeper into the tree line, and dimmed. The shadow in front of me shortened abruptly, returning to normal proportions. The heavy feeling in the air lifted. The light faded behind leaves and disappeared entirely, leaving the park dark like it always had been. I stood there for several seconds longer, barely breathing, waiting for it to reappear. It didn't. The buzzing finally stopped. I turned around quickly, eyes headlights, scanning the street behind me. Still empty. Still quiet. Same streetlights, same driveways. My pulse stayed fast as I walked home the rest of the way. No more strange shadows, no out-of-place glows. When I reached my driveway and unlocked the door, the porch light cast an ordinary, predictable silhouette across the concrete. Nothing stretched where it shouldn't. Nothing lagged. Inside, everything looked normal. Still, settled, familiar. I sat on the edge of my couch for a long time with the lights off, just staring at the window and the slice of night beyond it, half expecting the shadow to move again on its own. I woke to the faint impression of light pressing against my eyelids, like someone had turned on a lamp just inches from my face. My first thought was that I'd overslept and the sun was cutting through the cheap blinds. I opened my eyes and the room was completely dark again, quiet in that deep, heavy way that only happens before actual morning. I lay there for a second, listening. No waves against the rocks, no wind through the dune grass, just stillness. I checked my phone on the nightstand. 4:17 a.m. I was staying alone in a small coastal cabin outside of Yakats, Oregon. It belonged to an old coworker's aunt who rented it out whenever she wasn't there. I'd taken a few days off to clear my head and be by the ocean, which usually helped. The night before had been foggy and damp, one of those evenings where the mist barely moved and everything felt softened. I sat up slowly, expecting the light to return, but the ceiling and walls stayed swallowed in shadow. No glow, no hint of anything outside the thin curtains. Then I noticed the faint hum. It wasn't loud enough to pinpoint. It sounded like electrical noise, or maybe distant traffic, except there wasn't supposed to be any at that hour. It pulsed gently for a few seconds and then flattened into silence. I rubbed my eyes and stood, stepping barefoot across the wooden floor. The air felt colder than it should have been. I pulled the curtain back just a few inches and peered through the glass. Outside looked the same every other pre-dawn morning. Gray fog pressing low over the dunes, the outline of the beach barely visible. The horizon was gone completely. No moon, no stars. Still, I could swear the faint light had come from somewhere outside. I dropped the curtain and went back to bed, telling myself it was just my eyes adjusting or a half-dream bleeding into reality. Sleep eventually crept back in, but it didn't feel deep or normal. The next time I opened my eyes, the sky was pale blue through the fabric. Actual morning this time. 7 to 2 a.m. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window watching the fog shift lazily over the sand. Everything felt ordinary again, but there was a residue of that earlier moment sitting in the back of my mind, like I'd started a sentence and never finished it. Around 10, I walked down to the shore. The sand was cold and damp, dotted with washed-up kelp and smooth rocks. The ocean was calm, almost too calm. No whitecaps, just a steady rhythm of shallow waves. Halfway down the beach, I noticed the hum again. It was soft, nearly unnoticeable, but it vibrated faintly in my teeth, like standing near a power line. I looked around, expecting to see some weird maintenance vehicle or some kind of temporary equipment. There was nothing. Empty beach, fog thinning out toward the water. Out over the horizon, where the fog met the ocean, a faint pale glow hovered just above the line of gray. It wasn't bright. It didn't cast light onto the water. It just sat there, quiet and unmoving. I stood still, squinting at it. The glow didn't spread or shift. No reflection, no shadow, just a dim spot in the haze. A gull flew across my vision for a second, and when it passed, the light was still there. The hum deepened slightly. I felt that same strange awareness I'd felt earlier, like something had noticed I was aware of it. The glow drifted maybe a few feet to the right, smooth as if pulled along by an invisible track. I took a slow step back. The glow didn't follow, just hovered, steady. Then it dimmed. Not fast, not dramatic. It simply faded into the fog until I couldn't distinguish it from the gray sky anymore. The hum lingered for another few seconds before dissolving into the natural sounds of the beach. I stayed there longer than I meant to, waiting for it to reappear. It didn't. Back at the cabin, I tried to distract myself with normal stuff. Shower, emails, random scrolling. The whole day carried that same off feeling, though. The sky stayed overcast, the air damp and quiet. No wind, no real movement. Near sunset, I felt restless and stepped outside again. The clouds sat low and heavy, colored faintly with orange and purple streaks. Everything was calm to the point of discomfort. The faint hum returned once more, barely audible. I turned slowly, scanning the dunes, the tree line, the edge of the beach road. Nothing out of place. Then a soft reflection slid across the side window of the cabin, like light passing over it from something gliding above. I looked up instinctively. The cloud cover showed no gaps, no aircraft lights, no blinking dots, just a smooth ceiling of gray and gold. My shadow on the sand stretched too long for the angle of the fading sun. It pointed toward the dunes instead of behind me. I shifted my weight and watched it move. It corrected itself after a second, shrinking back to where it should have been, like it had snapped back into the right position. The hum paused, then returned lower, slower. I waited, barely breathing. A faint brightness formed again overhead, this time behind the thick clouds. It didn't break through, just glowed weakly through the layers, like something massive passing quietly behind them. No sound of engines, no rushing wind. It drifted from left to right, steady as a slow tide. When it reached the far side of my view, the brightness thinned and vanished, leaving the sky flat and dull again. The hum stopped. I stood there with my arms folded tight, heart beating harder than it should, staring at the space where the light had been. Nothing followed. No explanation came. When night settled fully, the beach fell silent except for the distant roll of the ocean. I went inside and locked the door, even though it was a habit more than anything practical. I turned off the lights and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the building creak softly with the cooling air. My eyes kept drifting toward the curtains, waiting for that faint glow to return. It didn't. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me back under, and even as I slept, part of me stayed half alert, expecting that silent brightness to press through my eyelids again from somewhere outside the quiet, fogged world. I noticed the dark shape before I even registered what it was doing. I'd stopped on a pull-off above the Mogollon Rim, just outside a tiny place called Clover Springs, staring up at a clear night sky that felt way too big and quiet. The nearest town lights were miles away, so the stars looked sharp, almost harsh. Then one section of sky started going dim, like something wide and solid was sliding in front of it. It didn't look like a cloud. It moved too clean, too steady, and there was no sound. No wind picked up. No rush of air. Just a smooth, slow blackness crossing the stars, blotting them out as it went. I stood there with my hands jammed in my hoodie pockets, trying to convince myself it was some weird low cloud or maybe the shadow of a high-altitude plane. But there were no blinking lights, no engine noise, nothing that felt normal about it. My name is Aaron Valdez. I'd driven out there after work because my head felt crowded and I needed space. The day had been hot and dry, that baked kind of heat that sticks to your skin even after the sun drops. By the time I reached the overlook, the air had cooled just enough to be bearable, and the sky was clear as glass. The shape kept moving, silent and heavy, like the night itself was sliding. It crossed about a third of the sky, and then slowed, almost pausing. The stars behind it vanished, like something wide and flat was blocking them. I held my breath and waited for a sound that never came. Then it resumed its glide and faded so gently I almost doubted I'd seen anything at all. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring where it had moved, my eyes searching for texture or edges or anything that made sense. The sky went back to normal. Millions of stars, quiet and distant. I climbed back into my car and told myself it had to be some trick of depth or light. A thin cloud, a long, low aircraft, something explainable. As I pulled back onto the narrow road, the feeling stayed with me, like I'd stepped into the wrong frame of a film. A few minutes later, my phone lost signal completely. No bars. That wasn't unusual out there, but it happened right when the air inside the car started feeling oddly still, almost heavy. The vents were off, windows cracked slightly, and yet the air stopped moving, like it had settled. Then the radio flicked to static without me touching it. I reached for the knob, turned it, and the static turned into a faint low tone. Not music, not interference, just a dull vibrating sound that felt more than heard. I glanced up through the windshield and saw the shape again. This time it wasn't blocking stars. It hovered above the ridge line ahead, darker than the sky but not completely solid. It looked like a long smudge stretched across the upper horizon, moving sideways in a way that didn't line up with anything natural. I slowed the car almost to a stop. The tone from the radio deepened slightly. The dash lights flickered for a split second, then settled. The shape slid further right, smooth as if pulled on an invisible track. No flicker, no rotation, just quiet movement. I realized I was gripping the steering wheel too tightly and forced my hands to loosen. My pulse felt loud in my ears. I watched it, waiting for it to react to me somehow, but it didn't. It just kept gliding, like it existed on its own schedule. It faded again, dissolving into the night sky as if absorbed by the darkness. The radio clicked back to silence. I sat there in the middle of the road for a few seconds before slowly driving home. The rest of the drive felt wrong, like the space around me had shifted slightly. I kept checking the mirrors, the sky, the sides of the road, expecting it to reappear. It didn't. At home, my sister Marisol texted asking if I wanted to grab breakfast the next morning. I responded like everything was fine, even though I still felt that uneasy sense of being noticed, even inside my own place. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up, thinking I saw shadows moving across the ceiling that never quite lined up with passing cars or the moon. Just before 6, I heard a faint vibration through the walls. Not loud, just a low, distant tremor. I sat up and listened. Outside, the air looked pale gray. Early morning light creeping in. I walked to the front door and opened it. the world looked normal. Quiet suburban street, a few parked cars, no sign of anything unusual. Then I noticed the tops of the trees at the end of the block moving slightly, even though the air around me felt completely still. And above them, just barely visible in the brightening sky, that same dark form moved again. Slower this time, almost patient. My stomach tightened. It passed behind a thin bank of rising cloud and faded away, leaving the sky looking ordinary and empty. No sound followed, no rush, just an absence that felt wrong. The rest of the day passed strangely. Time felt stretched, moments slipped without me quite noticing. My phone clock was fine, but I kept getting the sense I'd lost tiny pieces of time without any memory of what happened in between. By evening, the sky was clear again, the heat settling into a mild breeze. I debated going out to the overlook to see if it would happen again, but the thought filled me with a quiet dread I couldn't explain. Instead, I paced around my living room until the dark fully settled, and then the lights flickered. Not off, just a quick dip in brightness. The air pressure shifted slightly, like something heavy passed nearby. My ears picked up that faint low hum again, distant and steady. I walked out to the backyard, heart beating a little faster now, and looked up. There it was. The shape carved a smooth path across the stars, stretching lengthwise like an enormous silhouette. It moved with a calm, deliberate pace, as if it had all the time in the world. It blocked constellations piece by piece as it went. Orion disappeared behind it, then reappeared as the dark mass slid onward. I tracked it until my neck started to ache. I couldn't judge how high it was or how far away. It defied scale entirely. When it reached the far edge of the sky, it didn't speed up or change. It simply faded like it thinned into the night itself. The hum faded with it. I stood still long after it was gone, staring at empty air, trying to wrap my head around what I'd seen. My hands felt cold. My thoughts felt slow. Nothing followed. No explanation formed. Just quiet and distance and the sky going back to normal. Eventually I went inside and locked the door. I sat at the kitchen table until the stars blurred slightly from tired eyes. Sometime after midnight, I finally crawled into bed. Exhaustion crept over me whether I wanted it or not. Outside, the night stayed silent, and even as sleep pulled me under, I had the lingering sense that something vast had simply passed through, not caring whether I understood it at all. The air turned sharp all at once, like it did right before a storm rolled in, but the sky above the ferry landing on Whidbey Island still looked flat and heavy, not storm dark. I was standing next to my car checking messages when the pressure changed, that weird electric feeling you get in your teeth and skin. Everything went too still. Even the gulls stopped yelling. Then a faint light slid over the lot. It drifted without noise, pale and steady, like a reflection that had nothing to bounce off of. It passed just above the roofline of the ticket booth and moved out over the water. No thunder followed, no wind, just that tight, buzzing air and the glow fading like it never happened. My name is Caleb Rourke. I worked maintenance at the marina down the road and had pulled in after my shift to sit for a minute before heading home. It was already humid and close, that sticky kind of late summer evening where everything felt heavier than it should. The light didn't flare or streak. It just slid and softened into nothing. I stayed there, staring at the spot where it disappeared, trying to laugh it off in my head. Boats idled in the channel. Tide moved the kelp. Everything else looked normal. But the air still felt charged, like we were all paused, waiting for a storm that wasn't coming. I locked my phone and leaned against the hood of my car, telling myself it was just a weird reflection or maybe someone flying a drone further out. But no buzzing came after, no splash, no echo. When I got back into the car, the faint pressure feeling didn't go away. It sat on my chest, light but noticeable, like my breath didn't quite line up right. I pulled out of the lot and headed toward Coopaville, windows down, trying to cool off. My neighbor Marta had been texting me about her dog getting nervous earlier, which was already strange since her dog only reacted to fireworks or thunderstorms. I didn't respond. I kept one eye on the sky instead. A few minutes down the road, the same pale light appeared again, this time higher. It glided along the top of the cloud cover in a straight line, slow and calm, no blinking, no pulsing, just a clean shape moving across the gray. I slowed down almost to a crawl. It didn't react to anything. It wasn't chasing or drifting with the breeze. It looked like it was following a path only it knew. After about 10 seconds, it thinned out and vanished. My radio hissed quietly, even though I hadn't turned it on. I reached over and twisted the knob. The hiss didn't change. Then it dropped into a low hum that vibrated through the dashboard more than it filled the air. My stomach tightened. The hum matched the tight feeling in the air, like both were linked. I shut the radio off. The hum stopped immediately. The rest of the drive felt stretched out and muted. Streetlights glowed but didn't feel bright. Everything was washed in a dull tone like the world had a film over it. When I reached my place just outside town, the sky still looked wrong, like it was holding something back. I stepped out and the air felt dense again. That storm before storm feeling, even though the wind stayed dead. Across the field behind my house, another faint light shimmered low to the ground. Not bright, not strong, just enough to notice. It hovered there for a few seconds and then slid slowly toward the trees. I started walking without thinking. The grass didn't move as I crossed it, even though my boots should have rustled it. The sound felt delayed, like it came a second late. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but when I checked it, the screen lit and went dark again without showing a notification. The light slipped between the trees and faded. I stood at the edge of the field, heart beating harder now, feeling small and unsure for no clear reason. The woods looked normal. Shadows pooled where they should, no movement, no sound. Then a faint clicking came from somewhere above. Soft, mechanical but distant, like two dull stones being tapped together slowly. I looked up, but the sky was just flat and colorless. The clicking stopped. I walked back to the house slowly, every step feeling heavier than it should have been. When I reached my porch light flickered once, then settled. Inside, the air felt wrong too. Still, slightly cool without AC running. I poured a glass of water and noticed my hands shaking a little. I checked the time on the microwave. It read 7:12 p.m. On my phone, it read 7:28. I stared at both for a while, trying to figure out which one made sense. My messages to Marta showed as sent at 7:19, even though I didn't remember sending one. I chalked it up to a glitch and sat down on the couch, trying to steady my breathing. Outside, the sky slowly deepened into evening. That was when the light returned again. It moved across my backyard, casting a faint glow through the slats of the blinds. Not sharp, not blinding, just enough to change the tone of the walls. I stood and pulled the blinds slightly apart. It hovered a few feet above the grass, smooth and silent. It didn't touch anything. It didn't sway. It just existed there, steady and pale, like it had weight without mass. The air pressed thick and electric around me. My hands stayed frozen in place. I couldn't tell how long it stayed. Maybe seconds, maybe longer. I only knew that when it finally drifted upward and faded into the low clouds, my chest loosened like something had let go. The yard went dark again. Crickets started up like they'd been waiting for permission. I stepped outside carefully. The ground felt solid, normal, cool, damp air under my feet. No marks in the grass, no scorched earth. Nothing had changed except me. Above, the clouds rolled, slow and silent, and the charged feeling thinned bit by bit until it almost felt like a normal evening again. I stayed on the porch for a long time, listening to distant cars and the tide shifting somewhere beyond the trees. Eventually, my body settled enough to go back inside. I locked the door. I checked the yard once more through the kitchen window. Nothing glowed. Nothing moved. Just a calm night, and a sky that felt like it had briefly opened for something I couldn't understand, then closed again without a word. My headlights swept across the quiet street as I eased backward out of my driveway, the usual early morning routine I'd done 1,000 times. The beam caught something just above my neighbor's roofline, a pale shape hanging low and still, like it was resting on the air itself. It wasn't bright, just faint enough to see clearly against the dark sky. When I stopped the car out of instinct, the shape vanished. It didn't streak away or fade slowly. It was just gone. I sat there with my foot still pressed on the brake, staring at the roof of David Romero's place, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. The rest of the street looked normal. Porch lights glowed the way they always did. No sounds, no movement. The air felt heavy though, like before rain, even though the forecast had called for clear skies. I reversed a little more, checking the mirror, then glanced back up. Nothing. just shingles, an old antenna, and the dull outline of a tree behind his yard. My name is Marissa Doyle. I lived in a small cul-de-sac in eastern Oregon, not far from the edge of town where everything turned into scrub and fields. It was just after 5 in the morning, and I was heading to my shift at the bakery. Still half asleep, still stiff, still trying to wake up. Once I pulled fully onto the street, I paused again. Something about the air felt off. No wind, no birds, no usual low hum of distant traffic, just stillness. I told myself I'd caught a weird reflection, or my eyes were playing tricks in the dark. I turned the car toward the main road and drove off, but I kept glancing back in my mirror for a few blocks until the neighborhood faded behind me. The road was empty. Streetlights flickered over the asphalt, and I tried sinking back into normal thoughts like coffee and deadlines and the smell of fresh bread. But the image of that shape stayed fixed in my head. Not round, not sharp, just a dull outline with no clear edges. When I reached the first intersection, my radio switched to static without me touching it. A low, steady interference filled the car. I turned the knob down. The moment the volume dropped, the static stopped too. I frowned and tested it again. Silence. I drove on. The sky slowly lightened at the edges, that pale gray before sunrise. Just as the first hint of pink crept across the horizon, a soft glow reflected on my windshield like a passing headlight. But no car came the other way. The road ahead stayed empty. Later, during my break, I caught myself staring out the bakery window too long. My coworker Lena asked if I was all right. I nodded and said I was just tired. I didn't mention the shape above David's roof. It felt ridiculous even in my own mind. By the time I got home mid-morning, the sky was bright and clear. I pulled into my driveway slowly, eyes drifting upward without thinking. Nothing hovered over any rooftops. Everything looked normal again. I went inside, made a late breakfast, and tried to shake the feeling. But as the hours passed, small things kept feeling slightly off. My phone froze twice. The hallway clock stopped for a few minutes, then resumed. Outside, the air stayed strangely still. Around dusk, when the lights started to soften and the sky darkened, I stepped out onto my porch for fresh air. A thin vibration passed through the ground, faint but noticeable under my feet, like distant machinery. It only lasted a few seconds. I turned my head toward the rooftops across the street. There it was again. Low above David's house, the same dull shape hovered quietly. It didn't glow exactly. It wasn't dark either. Just a heavy presence against the sky, like a void that absorbed what little light touched it. My breath caught. I didn't move. It hovered for several moments, perfectly still. No sound, no motion, just presence. Then it slid backward, slow and smooth, until it slipped behind the line of trees and vanished. I checked the house windows. No one else seemed to notice. David's porch light clicked on and off as usual. A dog barked somewhere farther down the street. Normal life continued. I stayed outside longer than I should have, feeling watched without any clear reason. The air pressed thick around me, and that soft electric feeling returned, prickling along my arms. When I finally went back inside, I locked the door and sat on the couch, heart still beating heavier than normal. I tried distracting myself with TV, but the screen flickered once, then steadied. Later that night, just before I fell asleep, I found myself standing by the bedroom window, staring out at the rooftops again. The neighborhood lay quiet. Street lamps hummed faintly. No shapes lingered in the sky this time, but the silence felt deliberate. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the faint sound of shingles shifting. Not wind, just a soft scrape overhead. I held my breath, listening. The noise stopped. Outside, a weak glow crept across my ceiling for a second, then disappeared. I didn't look out the window. When morning finally came, the sky looked ordinary again. Birds chirped like nothing had ever happened. Cars rolled past the house and neighbors watered their lawns. And still, every time I reversed out of my driveway after that, my eyes drifted to that same patch of sky above David's roof, waiting to see if something would quietly hover there again and pretend it was never real. I woke to find a thin film of dust on my windowsill, disturbed in a perfect half circle. Outside, the grass was slightly flattened in the same shape. It took a second to register. My eyes were still foggy with sleep, the room dim and quiet. I sat up and leaned closer to the glass, tracing the curve with my fingertip. The mark was clean, like something had rested there and then lifted away. Not dragged, just placed. When I pulled the curtain back a little more, I saw the impression in the grass below, right outside my bedroom window. Same curve, same smooth edge, no footprints around it, no signs of struggle or movement, just that shape pressed into the dew. My name is Leanne Mercer. I lived alone in a small, weather-worn cottage on the edge of Willow Ridge, a farming town about an hour from the coast. The property sat between tall fields and a narrow stretch of woods that had always made the nights feel quieter than they should. It was early, still gray with morning haze. The air outside looked thick and damp, like fog that hadn't fully decided if it wanted to settle or lift. I pushed the window open and leaned out, half expecting the grass to spring back when I disturbed it. It didn't. The half circle stayed, pressed down as if something heavy but careful had been there for a while. A shiver ran through me, though the air wasn't cold. I stepped outside barefoot and walked over to the spot. The dew chilled my feet. The grass was bent in a clean arc, almost too deliberate. I crouched down and ran my hand along it. It felt normal, no heat, no smell, no crushed stems, just pressed. Probably raccoons, I muttered, even though that made no sense. I straightened up and scanned the area. No broken twigs, no marks from paws. The woods stood still, silent. Not even birds stirred. When I turned back toward the house, my eyes went automatically to the windowsill again. The curve was exactly aligned with the one on the ground, like it had been measured. I went back inside, locked the door out of instinct, and tried to laugh it off while making coffee. The house creaked as usual. The kettle hissed. Everything felt normal again, except that unsettling thought at the back of my head. Around mid-morning, while working remotely on my laptop, a low hum drifted through the air. It wasn't loud, just deep and steady, like distant power lines, but it didn't fade. The windows rattled faintly. When I stood and opened the door, the sound vanished instantly. No trucks passed, no planes overhead, just silence again. Around noon, my neighbor Carmine from down the dirt road called to check if I'd seen his stray goat. I mentioned the weird impression in the grass. He laughed and said deer sometimes moved in strange ways. His voice faded in and out over the phone like bad reception, even though I'd never had issues before. By late afternoon, the sky darkened with rolling clouds. The air turned heavy and damp, promising rain that never came. I kept finding myself glancing toward the window like I expected to catch something still crouched outside. At dusk, the power flickered once, just a blink. The lights returned immediately, but I noticed the outside lamp near my porch stayed slightly dimmer than usual. The hum returned again, low, steady, almost like vibration more than sound. It passed through the floorboards and into my feet. I stood still in the middle of the kitchen, listening, trying to place it. After several minutes, it tapered off slowly like something drifting away. When night finally settled, I stood on the porch watching the cloud cover move slowly across the sky. The moon struggled through the haze, giving everything a dull glow. That was when I saw it. Above the line of trees near the field, something hovered, pale, faint. Not quite solid, just there, low and quiet, like it belonged but clearly didn't. It didn't shine. It didn't flicker. It just existed, slightly brighter than the clouds around it, with no visible structure. The shape reminded me of that half circle from the morning, only now it hung in the air instead of resting on the ground. I held my breath without realizing. It stayed completely still as the clouds drifted past it, breaking around its edges. No sound came from it. No wind. No movement. Just presence. Then, as slowly as it appeared, it slid backward, retreating over the tree line and vanishing into the darkness. The moment it vanished, the air felt empty again, like pressure releasing. I stayed there longer than I should have, letting the night wrap around me. Everything else went back to normal sounds. Crickets, distant dogs, the familiar creak of the porch boards. Later, once inside, the dust on the windowsill bothered me again. I wiped it clean with a cloth. The half circle vanished easily, like it had never been there. But when I leaned toward the glass, I noticed faint streaks running downward, subtle lines like condensation that didn't match the streaks from rain or normal air moisture. I left the light off when I went to bed. Somewhere around 2 a.m, something brushed faintly against the side of the house. Not like a branch, softer. A gentle contact followed by near silence. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, too frozen to check. When morning came again, bright and clear, the grass outside had returned to normal. No half circle, no flattened patch. The air felt lighter. But the windowsill this time showed something new. A thin, curved line of dust had formed where I'd cleaned it, as though whatever touched it hadn't left yet. And when I stepped outside, I could have sworn the ground felt slightly warm right where the shape had been. A soft mechanical hum filled the night for several seconds. When it stopped, the silence felt unnaturally deep. I was sitting on the back steps of my cousin's coastal cabin in Port Ainslie, trying to cool off after a long day of hauling firewood and fixing a busted fence panel. The air was damp and warm, one of those sticky late summer evenings where the ocean breeze barely did anything. It was just past 10, and the sky was a dull purple fading into black. No stars yet, just low clouds drifting in from the water. My name is Lila Monroe. I'd driven out to stay a few nights alone while my cousin Trevor was away for work. He always said the place was quiet and peaceful, but that hum didn't feel peaceful at all. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, steady, almost clean, like the sound of something running smoothly on its own terms. I leaned forward, trying to identify where it was coming from. The small gravel drive beside the cabin was empty, just my dusty Subaru and a couple old kayaks stacked against the shed. The trees stood still. No breeze, no rustling. The waves rolled gently in the distance. When the hum cut off, the silence pressed in hard. Too hard, like the world had paused to listen. I stayed seated, heart starting to go faster, waiting for it to return. It didn't. Instead, the distant ocean sounded weirdly faint, like someone had turned the volume down. I stood up and walked a few steps onto the sand, barefoot, letting the coolness ground me. The clouds above drifted slowly, but even their movement felt muted. I swear the night air felt thicker around my shoulders. A faint glow shimmered to the left, near the edge of the shore. Not bright, just a soft haze, almost like moonlight catching on mist, except the moon wasn't even out yet. I squinted at it. The glow slid sideways along the waterline, smooth and level, then blinked out. "Okay," I said quietly, more to hear my own voice than anything else. I walked closer to the shoreline, wet sand squishing under my feet. Every few steps, I glanced back at the cabin, its porch light steady and normal. No flickering, no weirdness, just a plain yellow bulb over a screen door. The hum returned, shorter this time, vibrating faintly through my chest. I could feel it more than hear it, like when a truck passes too close, except nothing was moving. My shoulders tensed. I turned slowly in a full circle. Still nothing. Then the hum vanished again, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like even the insects had stopped. I didn't like that at all. A few seconds later, a thin reflection slid across the surface of the water, as if something unseen just below it had moved. There wasn't a splash, no ripples, just a subtle shift in how the light looked. I backed up a step. Another faint reflection passed closer to shore, then faded as if it had dipped beneath the surface. The water looked calm again, but I felt watched in a way that didn't match the empty beach around me. I started walking back toward the steps, keeping my eyes on the shoreline the whole time. The sand felt colder now, and the air carried a strange heaviness. Halfway back, the hum returned, longer and steadier. It almost felt like it was above me now. I tilted my head up. The clouds glowed faintly in one spot, directly overhead, a soft, milky patch where everything else remained dark. The glow was stable, not flashing, not pulsing, just hanging there, quiet and wrong. My heart thudded in my ears. I stood frozen, staring up. The glow shifted slightly to the east, smooth and controlled, and the hum shifted with it, like they were tied together. A few seconds passed, then maybe 10. I lost track. The glow slowly dimmed until the clouds looked normal again. The hum faded right along with it. The silence afterward hit even harder than before. My ears felt like they were underwater. I forced myself to move, walking faster now, climbing the steps to the porch. The wooden boards creaked under my weight, a familiar sound that suddenly felt comforting. Inside, the cabin air was cooler, carrying the faint smell of salt and pine cleaner. I closed the sliding door and locked it, my hands shaking more than I wanted to admit. For a minute, nothing happened. Then the hum came back, softer, almost distant, like it was farther away now. I pressed my forehead lightly against the glass, trying to see through the reflection into the night. Outside, the sand looked the same. The trees stood still. The shoreline glimmered faintly. A soft band of light slid across the water again, slower this time. It arced slightly, then straightened as if adjusting its path. Still no splash, no sound. Every nerve in my body tightened. The light drifted farther out, then stopped completely. Just hung there, faint but distinct, hovering maybe a few feet above the surface. The hum decreased until it was barely noticeable, more like a pressure shift in sound. I waited, barely breathing. The water beneath that faint glow remained perfectly still. After what felt like a long while, the light dimmed and folded into the darkness until it was gone. The hum disappeared with it. I kept staring long after it vanished, expecting it to rush back or flare up brighter. Nothing did. Eventually, the normal ocean sounds returned. Gentle waves, a distant gull, a whisper of breeze. The night felt slightly less heavy, but not normal. Not right. I stayed inside for the rest of the evening, lights low, trying to distract myself with the old TV. Trevor kept beside the couch. Every now and then, I swore I could still feel a faint vibration in the floor, though that might have been my nerves refusing to calm down. Before heading to bed, I checked out the window one last time. The shoreline looked ordinary again. Dark water, pale sand, quiet trees. As I turned away, the glass caught a faint shimmer for a split second, like the afterimage of a light had just passed by. When I looked back, there was nothing there. The cabin stayed silent after that, but the air never fully felt the same. Like the night had pressed its hand against the world for a moment and pulled away, leaving behind an invisible mark that refused to fade. Walking home late, every reflective surface ahead briefly glowed at once. Storefront windows, car mirrors, puddles along the curb, even the brushed metal on a bus stop pole, all lit up like someone had swept a pale flashlight across the whole street. The glow faded almost instantly, and when it did, everything looked duller than before, like the night had thickened. I slowed down without thinking and looked up, expecting to see a helicopter or some badly aimed floodlight. The sky was low and foggy, the kind that swallowed stars and made the street lamps look like they were underwater. It had been spitting light rain on and off all evening, just enough to leave the pavement slick, but not enough to feel like real weather. My name is Jonah Pritchard. I lived in a second-floor apartment near the old canal in Merriwick, one of those towns that used to have factories and now mostly had empty brick buildings and a couple bars trying too hard. I'd worked late at the print shop and was heading home along the river path instead of the main road, mostly because it was quieter. After the glow, the path felt off. The lamps were still on, but their light didn't seem to reach as far as it should have. It wasn't darker exactly, just flatter, like my eyes weren't adjusting right. I checked behind me. No one. A couple parked cars, a damp bench, and the slow roll of fog creeping off the canal. The only sound was my shoes on wet gravel and the faint slap of water against the concrete bank. I kept walking, but every now and then I caught tiny flashes in the corner of my vision, like quick reflections that didn't match anything around me. I stopped near an old row of boarded-up storefronts, watching the ground. The puddles were still, no ripples, no breeze. My breath came out steady. A low hum slipped through the air for a few seconds. It wasn't loud, more like pressure than sound, the kind that made your teeth feel slightly tight. Then it stopped as suddenly as it started. Further down the street, a bike leaned against a railing. Its chrome handlebar ends caught another brief shimmer, barely a second long, then went matte again. I stared at it, half expecting it to flare up again, but it stayed dull. "I'm just tired," I muttered, even though my voice sounded strange in the quiet. I resumed walking, faster now. My heartbeat had picked up, not panic, but alert, like my body was noticing something my brain couldn't quite name. As I passed the old corner deli, the glass door rattled lightly, even though there was no wind. The bell inside didn't move. The hum returned, deeper this time, followed by a faint sensation like the soles of my shoes were vibrating against the ground. I froze again. The vibration lasted maybe 5 seconds, then faded out like something moving away. When I looked ahead, every reflective surface along the next block flickered together once more. Not bright, just enough to register. The windows of parked cars, the glossy paint on a fire hydrant, a wet mailbox, all of it responded like it was reacting to something passing through. but the street itself remained empty. Something about the way the reflections behaved made my skin crawl. It wasn't random, it felt timed, coordinated. I glanced at my phone. The screen reflected my face back at me in the dimness. For a split second, the reflection brightened, then dulled again. The time read 12:11 a.m. I shoved the phone back into my pocket, suddenly sure I didn't want any more light. A dog barked once somewhere far off, then another, then silence. I turned onto Alder Row, a stretch that usually had at least some traffic noise from the highway, but tonight it felt sealed off. The fog thickened, swallowing the end of the street in a gray wall. Halfway down the block, I noticed something drifting across the reflective surface of a window. Not a person, not a shadow with a clear edge. Just a slow, soft blur that moved against the shape of the glass like something passing close by, though there was nothing actually there. I stepped closer, staring, heart thudding. Nothing. But my own reflection looked slightly off, stretched like the night behind me was deeper than it should have been. The hum returned again, longer now, steady and low. My chest felt tight. The air seemed heavier, as though the humidity had doubled all at once. Then every reflective surface lit up again, brighter this time. Not blinding, just clear. A pale wash that rolled forward down the street like a wave, hitting windows, puddles, metal, then passing on. And after it went, the street looked darker than before. Like the lamps had collectively dimmed, even though I knew they hadn't. I hurried now, boots splashing through shallow puddles. My breathing was quick and sharp, fogging in the damp air. I could feel that same hum through my legs again, faint but undeniable. I reached the bridge over the canal and gripped the cold railing, trying to steady myself. The water below was black, barely moving. The reflections of the streetlights shivered slightly, then smoothed out again. Across the canal, I spotted a faint glow hovering maybe 20 feet above the tree line. Soft and muted, the same color as the earlier reflections, but suspended, like a blurred star hovering too low to make sense. It drifted slowly to the right, perfectly level, making no sound at all. I stood there watching it, barely breathing. It didn't flash, didn't pulse. It just hovered, calm and deliberate, like it belonged. Then it slid further into the fog and disappeared. The hum stopped at the same moment. The air felt lighter after that, though my hands were still shaking. I forced myself to keep walking, every step feeling too loud. When I finally reached my apartment building, the entry lights looked normal again, casting their usual yellow circle. No strange reflections, no flickers, just boring concrete and tired brick. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and pine cleaner. The familiar creak of my floorboards felt grounding in a way I hadn't realized I needed. I locked the door behind me, checked it twice, and leaned my forehead against the wood for a second, letting my breathing slow. When I pulled the curtains aside, the window reflected my dim living room back at me. For a heartbeat, the glass shimmered faintly, like the afterimage of a light that wasn't there anymore. Then it settled into stillness. I stood there a while longer, waiting for another glow, another hum, anything to happen. Nothing did. The night stayed quiet, but the feeling of the street being just slightly wrong never fully faded. The radio faded from an old country station into soft static without me touching anything. I glanced down at the dial, thinking maybe I'd bumped it, but both my hands were still on the steering wheel. Outside the windshield, a dull glow hovered at the very end of the gravel road, about where the tree line started. It wasn't bright, just enough to notice against the dark. I was parked up on the overlook outside Marine Falls, the one people used when they didn't feel like hiking all the way down to the water. It was late, probably close to 10, and the air had that damp, salty feel that came off the ocean. A thin layer of fog hung low over everything, but the sky above was clear enough to see a few stars. My friend Caleb had canceled on a late-night drive, so I'd gone alone just to clear my head. The glow didn't move yet. It just floated there, steady and quiet, like it had always been part of the road. I turned the engine off to see if the radio would reset, and the static kept going for another 2 seconds before cutting out completely. The sudden quiet felt heavy. I rolled my window down a crack and waited to hear the usual night sounds. Bugs, distant traffic, the ocean far off, but everything sounded muted, like someone had lowered the volume on the world. The light pulsed once, faintly, Not flickering, more like a slow inhale and exhale. I told myself it was probably someone's headlights angled weird through the fog. That stretch of road got almost no traffic, but it wasn't impossible. I leaned forward to see if I could spot any shape behind the glow, but there was nothing. Just woods and that single dim point. Then my phone buzzed and scared the hell out of me. It was a text from my neighbor Gina asking if I'd picked up my mail again. I looked at my signal and noticed it had dropped to 1 bar, which was strange for this spot. Usually it was full out here. I typed back that I'd grab it tomorrow, hit send, and watched the message hang there for a solid 10 seconds before finally going through. When I looked back up, the glow had shifted slightly to the right, not rising or falling, just sliding sideways, like it was following the line of the road. I eased my foot back onto the brake and turned the key to start the car. The engine hesitated before finally kicking over. The dashboard lights came on dimmer than usual. I waited another minute, just staring, trying to convince myself I was overthinking it. The glow slid a little more and then stopped again. A soft hum started, barely audible. Not from the car. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. The kind of sound you'd feel more than hear, like a vibration pressing gently against your ears. I checked my mirrors. No cars, no people, no movement. Just me and that light. I pulled forward slowly, tires crunching on the gravel. The glow stayed the same distance away, like it was tied to my car with an invisible string. 10 feet forward, it moved 10 feet too. I stopped. It stopped. My pulse picked up, and the air inside the car felt suddenly too warm. I rolled the window further down and called out, half joking, half nervous. "Hello?" My voice sounded small. It didn't echo. The forest line at the end of the road looked darker than it should have, as if the light wasn't really touching anything around it. The hum thickened for a moment, then dropped just as quickly, leaving my ears ringing softly. My headlights flicked once, like someone tapped the switch, but my hands never moved. I felt that cold, creeping feeling in the pit of my stomach, the one you get when you realize a situation is shifting out of normal territory. I decided I didn't need to be brave. I reversed carefully, eyes locked on that glow. As the car rolled back, the light drifted with me, still keeping its distance. The fog around it started to thin, but the glow didn't get brighter. It stayed dull and smooth, almost flat. Another strange thing happened. My clock on the dashboard changed from 10:14 to 10:16 in a blink, skipping a minute. I hadn't even been out there long enough to notice time passing. The radio snapped back on for a second. A low burst of static followed by a faint voice that didn't sound like music or a DJ, just a clipped mumble, too distorted to make out. Then silence again. I backed all the way until I was nearly at the main road. The glow finally stopped moving and hovered where the gravel met the trees. It stayed there, motionless, like it had finished whatever it was doing. I put the car in park and sat there breathing slowly, trying to calm the trembling in my hands. The hum had softened but never fully faded. I watched for another minute, then another. The glow dimmed just a little, then suddenly slid upward and vanished into the fog without any trailing light or sound. The night felt wrong after that. Too quiet, too empty. I waited a few more moments before pulling out onto the main road. As I drove home, the radio behaved normally, playing some late-night talk show, but I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, expecting to see that dim light floating behind me again. The rest of the drive passed in a haze. Streetlights flickered as I came back into town, and I noticed a few porch lights turning on and off randomly, but I didn't know if that meant anything or if my brain was just trying to connect dots. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a long time before getting out. The air felt heavy again, like before a storm, but the sky was still clear. Inside, everything looked normal. My dog barely lifted his head when I walked in, which was strange on its own. Later, lying in bed, I replayed the whole thing over and over. The static, the way the light kept pace, the skipped minute. I checked my phone again before sleeping. My sent text to Gina showed the timestamp as 10:15 p.m., even though I swore I sent it closer to when I first pulled up. I never saw the glow again. But sometimes when I drive past that overlook now, my radio softens for just a second, like it's about to slip back into static, and I feel that same tight pressure in the air, like something is paying attention just beyond the edge of view. The star brightened suddenly, like someone had turned up a dimmer switch. It held that brightness for a few seconds, then softened again, fading back into the rest of the sky as if it had moved farther away from me. I was sitting on the hood of my car at a small overlook off Highway 50 in eastern New Mexico, the kind of spot people used to park at to look at the sky or take a break from driving. It was late, close to midnight, and the desert air had cooled fast after a warm day. A thin wind slid through the brush, bringing the dry smell of dirt and sage. My name is Victor Hale, and I'd pulled over because the road was getting to me. It had been hours of straight darkness, just headlights cutting through empty land. I figured 10 minutes under the stars would settle my head. They were clear that night. No clouds, no haze, just a wide spread of white points. I leaned back against the windshield and let my eyes drift across them. That's when I noticed the one that changed. At first, I thought it was a plane, but there was no blinking, no sound, no steady path. It swelled brighter, then eased back like it was retreating. I watched it hard, trying to see if it repeated. It didn't. It just stayed faint and still again. I let out a slow breath and tried to laugh it off. The desert played tricks sometimes. Heat shimmer, weird perspective, tired eyes. I told myself that and shifted on the hood. A few moments later, the wind stopped completely. Not just died down, stopped, like someone hit mute on the world. The brush froze, the distant hiss of insects cut out. Even the low hum from my car's cooling engine sounded dulled. I sat up, muscles tight. The silence felt heavy, like the air had more weight to it. That same star flickered faintly again, not brighter this time, just weaker, as if it was struggling. I stared, squinting, and noticed it wasn't exactly where it had been before. Barely off, but off enough to make my stomach turn. My phone suddenly went dark in my hand. No warning, no vibration. The screen just blacked out. I pressed the button. Nothing. A low vibration crept through the metal hood beneath me. Soft, steady, more like a pressure than a sound. I slid off the car slowly, boots crunching on gravel, and stood there staring upward like an idiot. The vibration passed through my chest, light but steady. My teeth felt faintly numb. I whispered, "What the hell?" without really meaning to. Another star nearby dimmed slightly, then returned. Then the first one grew brighter again, stronger this time, enough to throw a faint sheen over the landscape. It was still silent. No streak, no motion, just this slow idea of distance shifting. The vibration grew slightly stronger and then cut off all at once. The silence that followed felt unreal. 30 seconds might have passed, or maybe 5 minutes. I wasn't sure. My sense of time felt stretched and thin. The wind returned slowly, brushing across my face. The insects resumed. The star settled back to normal. I looked down at my phone. The screen flickered and came back. The clock read 12:47 a.m. I knew I'd parked around 12:20. My stomach tightened. I checked my call log. No missed calls, no notifications, just a normal screen like nothing had happened. I glanced back up, but the sky looked ordinary again. Calm, quiet, empty. I got back in the car and shut the door, though I didn't start the engine yet. I just sat there, listening to my own breathing. My hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. A faint glow moved along the horizon far ahead, low and flat. It didn't illuminate the ground or the scrub, just hovered and slid smoothly left to right before fading into nothing. I told myself it had to be distant headlights or some reflection off the road. But the road curved miles away, and the glow didn't behave like a car. A strange sense of pressure filled my ears again, light but uncomfortable, like the start of a headache. I turned the key and started driving, needing motion, needing the familiar rhythm of tires on asphalt. As I pulled back onto the highway, the glow reappeared off to my right, keeping pace with me. Same speed, same distance, no change. I tried to ignore it and focused on the road. The sky stayed clear. The stars looked normal now, but that pressure never fully lifted. The glow drifted slightly backward, then forward again, steady and silent. My heart beat faster, despite my attempts to stay calm. After a few miles, it faded, just dissolving into the night. I didn't slow down. The rest of the drive passed uneasily quiet. No music on the radio, no static, just the low hum of the road and my own breathing. When I finally reached my small rental outside Roswell, the place looked normal. Porch light on, screen door swinging slightly in the breeze. I parked and sat for another minute, gathering myself. Inside, I turned on the lamp in the living room. The normal yellow light helped a little. I dropped my keys on the small wooden table and glanced out the front window. For a second, I thought I saw a faint shimmer high in the sky, barely visible, moving slowly away from where I stood. Then it was gone. The air inside felt still, too still, as if sound didn't want to move. I pulled the curtain shut and leaned against the cool wall, breathing slow, trying to ground myself in the solid feel of the room. Outside, the night stayed quiet. No hum, no vibration, just the distant whisper of desert wind moving over empty land. The shadow slid over my lawn slow and smooth, like something tall had walked between the moon and the ground. The problem was the sky was clear. No clouds, no birds, no trees swaying high enough to cast anything that wide. When it passed, the air around me dropped cold like a door had been opened somewhere I couldn't see. I stood there with my hands in my hoodie pockets, looking down at the grass where it had just been. The frost that had been soft a second earlier now felt sharper under my boots. My breath showed more than it should have for early fall. This was behind my uncle's place in a quiet part of rural Idaho, just outside a town called Parker's Ford, that most people drove past without noticing. I'd been staying a few nights while helping him clear some land behind the house. He was already asleep, and I'd stepped out for some air before turning in. The yard stretched out into a slope of uneven grass and weeds, then dipped toward a line of bare trees. The moon hung low and bright, lighting everything in flat silver. The shadow had cut right across that open space from the tree line toward the far fence, without making any sound. I scanned the sky again, expecting something obvious. Nothing moved. The stars looked sharp and fixed. I took a few steps forward, crunching over frosty patches. The cold lingered in the exact path the shadow had traveled like a trail. I reached down and brushed the grass. It felt stiff and damp, colder than the rest around it. A low buzzing crept into the air, barely more than a vibration. I straightened up and listened, trying to figure out where it came from. Not the house, not the road. It felt like it filled the yard instead of coming from a point. I glanced back at the porch. The light was still on, yellow and normal. Everything near the house looked the same as it always did. Behind me, though, the open space felt heavier. "Hello?" I called, not expecting anyone to answer. Nothing did. I walked a bit farther, staying just inside the range of the porch light. That buzz faded out, replaced by a thick silence. Not even crickets. I'd grown up around fields like this and knew they were never truly quiet. Then the shadow drifted again, this time closer. It crossed the grass about 10 feet in front of me, broad and solid like something massive had passed overhead. I looked up fast. The sky was still wide open. No clouds, no contrails, no movement except a faint, pale smudge high above, just barely darker than the surrounding stars. It moved too smoothly to be anything normal, almost going sideways before easing out of view. My phone vibrated in my hand. I didn't remember pulling it out. The screen showed no notifications, just the lock screen glowing dim. The time said 10:17. I could have sworn it had been just after 9 when I walked outside. I stepped back toward the house, heart thudding harder than the situation seemed to justify. The temperature around me climbed back to normal the closer I got to the porch, like whatever cold that thing caused only existed in a strip across the yard. I paused near the steps and looked back again. The grass lay flat now in a curved line where the shadow had passed, as if something heavy had brushed over it without touching. Another low vibration rolled faintly through the ground, like distant thunder without the storm. I stayed still, every sense locked on the open space. My neighbor, Ronnie Keeler, lived about half a mile away and sometimes walked his dog late. I found myself hoping to see his porch light flick on, or hear his truck, anything normal. Instead, another dark form slid across the moonlight, wider than the first. It moved slower, deliberate, and as it crossed, the stars behind it dulled faintly, like they'd been pressed through fog. When it reached the far edge of the yard, the cold hit again, sharper this time, biting through my clothes. I shivered hard and stepped fully back onto the porch. The shape stopped moving once it cleared the fence, hovering somewhere beyond it. The buzz returned, soft and steady, and my skin prickled along my arms. I couldn't tell if it came from up above or from the ground itself. I watched it for what felt like several minutes. It never came closer, never pulled away, just stayed there, dark against a sky that should have been empty. My phone screen lit again without me touching it. No signal bars, no service icon, just blank. I swallowed and whispered, "Nope," more to ground myself than anything else, then turned and went inside. I locked the door even though I knew nothing real had approached. From the kitchen window, I watched the yard again. The shadow was gone. The grass looked mostly normal, except for a faint, flattened arc that caught the moonlight differently. The cold had retreated too, leaving the night back to its usual chill. I sat at the table for a while, hands wrapped around a mug of reheated coffee that probably did nothing for my nerves. The silence felt off, like it carried some kind of echo just under the surface. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed. Sometime in the early morning, I woke to the same low vibration, barely there. My room stayed dark, but I felt that same pressure, like something was hovering just outside the walls. I stared at the ceiling, listening, not daring to check the window. The sound faded away on its own. When I stepped outside after sunrise, the yard looked almost normal again. The frost from the night before had melted, but that half circle in the grass was still pressed down slightly, as if something had paused there longer than it should have. The sky above was clear and bright, no trace of anything unusual. I didn't mention it to my uncle while he made breakfast. He talked about fence posts and work for the day like nothing had shifted. I kept finding myself glancing up every time the air felt even slightly cooler than it should, half expecting to see that smooth shape crossing silently overhead again, leaving only a strange shadow and colder air in its wake. The feeling hit first, like someone had stepped too close behind me without making a sound. I didn't hear anything, but I knew, in a way that made no sense, that something was up there, above the trees. I slowed down and tilted my head back. For a split second, I saw a tiny point of light hanging in the clouds. Then it slid behind a thicker patch and disappeared. I stood on the Crescent Ridge Trail just outside Taos, halfway between the lower switchbacks and the narrow overlook. The sun had already dropped behind the mountains, leaving that gray-blue light that makes everything feel flat and quiet. The air smelled damp from earlier rain, and the dirt had just enough moisture to make my boots crunch but not stick. I hadn't planned on staying out this late. I'd told my sister Maribel I'd be back before dark, but the hike had taken longer than I thought. I figured one more stretch before heading back wouldn't hurt. Still, that tiny light had pulled my attention straight up, even though there was no reason for it. I waited, staring at the clouds, expecting it to reappear. Nothing did. The sky just looked heavy and low, like it was about to sink into the tops of the pines. I shook it off and started walking again. A few steps in, I realized the wind had stopped completely. Not faded, just gone. The branches above me froze mid-sway, and the usual night critter sounds dropped away. No bugs, no distant birds, no rustling. I checked my phone. Signal was gone, which wasn't unusual up here, but the screen brightness dimmed on its own, then brightened again. I adjusted it back, slightly annoyed, and kept moving. Another strange thing. The trail markers I recognized looked a little off, turned sideways like someone had nudged them just enough to look wrong. I stopped beside one and corrected it, then noticed the one further up the path pointing the same slightly crooked angle. A dull hum started, so faint I almost thought it was my breathing. I paused and listened. It didn't come from any direction. It just filled the space around me for a few seconds, then softened until I could barely tell if I'd imagined it. I took a few more steps and felt the pressure again, that sense of being watched from above. I glanced up fast this time. Another tiny light slid between two cloud layers and vanished like it had passed behind a curtain. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was probably a satellite or some plane reflecting light wrong, but the way it moved didn't feel natural. It hadn't blinked. It had just glided. I checked behind me. The trail was empty. The forest leaned quietly inward. No voices, no footsteps. Just my own breathing and the soft scrape of boots on damp ground. When I looked back down, I noticed something that really didn't sit right. Next to my left boot print was another one, slightly shallower, same size, same pattern, but I hadn't walked side by side with anyone. I crouched to look closer. The second print stopped about 2 feet ahead, then picked up again a few steps later. I straightened slowly and scanned the trees. Still nothing. The silence around me felt thicker than before, like it pressed against my ears. I started moving again, picking up my pace this time. My phone vibrated with a delayed message from Eli, a coworker asking if I'd be in tomorrow. The timestamp said it came through 9 minutes earlier, even though I was certain the phone hadn't buzzed before now. The hum returned, a little stronger but still soft. It made the ground feel faintly alive under my feet. I stopped, swallowing hard, and looked up just as that pinpoint light reappeared, sliding across the sky and tucking itself behind another cloud layer. The wind still hadn't come back. The air smelled metallic now, sharp and dry, like right before a storm that never comes. I muttered, "All right," mostly to hear my own voice. It sounded small and thin. My words didn't travel far at all. I turned around and headed downhill. The light stayed above, reappearing every now and then, never getting closer but never vanishing fully either. Each time I noticed it, that tight certainty returned, like it was tracking the path I moved along. Halfway down the trail, my headlamp flickered and briefly went dim. I tapped it and it steadied again, but I could feel my heart thudding harder now. The forest seemed unfamiliar, even though I'd walked this route dozens of times. I checked my watch. It said 8:42. I felt like I couldn't have been hiking that long, but the sky suggested otherwise. 5 minutes later, I checked again. It read 8:53. I reached a clearing where the trees opened into a small stretch of rock and low brush. The clouds above moved slowly again, but the air below stayed dead and still. The tiny light hovered once more, brighter than before, then slipped away behind the cloud mass like it had never been there. The hum dropped out completely. The silence that followed felt wrong, too smooth, like the world had been muted. I didn't wait around after that. I kept moving, faster now, not running but steady. The trail finally widened, and I could see the faint glow of parked cars down near the base. Real light. Normal light. As I made my way down the final slope, the wind returned in small gusts, carrying the normal mountain smells with it. Leaves rustled, and somewhere a bird chirped once. It all felt like someone had flipped a switch back on. When I reached my car, I stood there for a moment, breathing out slowly, waiting for that strange pressure to return. It didn't. The sky looked ordinary again, just clouds and dark. I drove home without checking the rear view too much, even though the urge stayed there. Inside my apartment, everything sounded normal. The fridge hummed, the floorboards creaked, and my phone finally showed full signal again. Later, laying on my couch, I checked the photos I'd randomly snapped during the hike. Most were blurred or dark, but one, taken when I didn't remember lifting my phone, showed the tree line and a faint point of light higher than it should have been, softened by cloud. I turned the screen off and set it face down, letting the quiet settle back in around me, knowing I had no clue what I'd seen. Just the feeling that whatever it was had been calmly watching from somewhere above the clouds. The first light appeared right as I set my coffee down on the cold wooden railing. It was just after 5 in the morning, that thin stretch of time before the sun even thought about coming up. I'd driven out to Harrow Point because I couldn't sleep again, and the pier was the only place around here that felt quiet without feeling crowded. The ocean was flat and dark, the air damp with that salty chill that crept into your bones if you stood still too long. My name's Callum Pierce, and I'd lived along this stretch of coast most of my life. I knew what boats looked like at a distance. I knew what buoys looked like. I knew how the moonlight hit the water when the sky stayed clear. This wasn't any of that. A small white dot just hovered above the surface about 50 yards out, glowing faintly like a reflection that forgot to ripple. It didn't bob. It didn't waver. It just held there, perfectly still, as if pinned to the air. I frowned and squinted, trying to find some rational angle for it. Maybe a fishing light? Maybe someone had anchored a boat in the dark? Then another light appeared beside it. Then another. 3, 4, 5. A neat row of pale points arranged in a gentle curve, hovering just above the slowly breathing water. No sound came from them. No buzzing. No splash. The waves moved beneath without ever disturbing their position. I set my mug down carefully and leaned forward, gripping the railing. "What are you?" I muttered, though my voice sounded strangely small against the open water. The fog hung low around the pier, thin enough to see through, but thick enough to blur the edges of everything. The lights glowed steady, almost calm. The longer I stared, the more wrong it felt that nothing else on the surface responded to them. A fishing boat should rock, should creak, should shift. These didn't. I glanced down the length of the pier behind me, half expecting to see someone else standing there staring too. But the boards stretched empty past the old bait shack, damp and dark, no movement except an occasional seagull settling. I looked back at the lights. They hadn't moved at all. My pulse quickened, not explosive panic, just awareness. Like when you realize a stranger has been standing too close for too long. Then, without slowing, the first light sank straight down. No ripple, no splash. Just dipped below the surface and vanished. Then the second followed, then the third. They didn't drift. They didn't fade. Each one lowered with strange precision and disappeared beneath the water like it was being gently pulled into another place. The last light remained for a few seconds longer, hovering alone, then sank as well. The ocean returned to darkness. I stood frozen, half bent over the railing, waiting to see something surface. Waiting for a wave or a sign that any of it made sense. Nothing came. Just gentle water and a tired fog. I straightened slowly and looked around again as if someone had to be messing with me. The horizon looked empty. No boats, no silhouettes, no reflections. A thin breeze stirred the back of my neck. I waited another minute, then another. Nothing reappeared. The logical part of my brain tried to step in, maybe lights from a distant structure, maybe reflections from a passing vessel I couldn't see, but the way they lowered so cleanly didn't line up with anything I knew. I turned and walked halfway down the pier, listening to my shoes tap softly against the damp planks. The gulls stayed quiet. The water lapped slow and even. Everything else returned to its normal state, like nothing odd had occurred. But the feeling didn't fade. I kept glancing out across the same stretch of water, expecting the lights to break through again. They didn't. I let out a slow breath and told myself I'd imagined the sinking part, that maybe fatigue and fog had twisted perspective, that I just needed sleep. Still, I didn't feel brave enough to walk back toward the car right away. I leaned against one of the wooden support posts and watched the horizon until the sky began to lighten just slightly. A soft gray started bleeding into the far edge of the ocean. The fog thinned. The day crept back. Just as I began to relax, I noticed another faint glow farther down the water. A single point. Motionless. My shoulders tensed faster this time. It didn't multiply. It just stayed there, barely shimmering, the same pale white I'd seen before. I held my breath, waiting. Slowly, another appeared beside it. Then another. A new row forming farther out. My skin prickled. I stepped closer to the edge of the pier, ignoring the slick boards under my boots. The lights hovered again, just above the surface, maintaining the same careful spacing as before. The fog around them caught the glow faintly, creating a dim halo. They stayed still for longer this time. Longer than felt comfortable. No boat emerged. No explanation revealed itself. Then, one by one, they sank again. Straight down. Gone. The ocean smoothed over as if they'd never been there at all. A sickness twisted gently in my stomach. Not sharp, not overwhelming, just unsettled. Like something had calmly happened in front of me and refused to include any logic. I backed away from the railing and glanced over my shoulder again, the quiet behind me suddenly feeling heavier than usual. Still no one. I told myself this time I was leaving. I turned and walked down the length of the pier toward the parking lot, every creak of the wood echoing louder than it should have. The air warmed slowly as the sun started painting pale color along the edge of the horizon. From the lot, I couldn't see the same spot where the lights had hovered, but the calm of the water felt deceptive now, like it remembered something I didn't. The drive home passed without anything else strange. Normal early traffic. Normal sleepy faces at the corner gas station. Normal light blooming across the town like it always had. Still, every time I thought about that moment, the sinking of those lights replayed too clearly. That evening, after the sun dipped and the sky returned to soft gray, I found myself checking the time without fully meaning to. By 9, sleep still wouldn't come. By 10, I felt pulled again. I didn't fight it. I drove back to the pier, parking in almost the same spot as before. The air felt calmer now, less fog, more still. The water darker. I walked out slowly, each step carrying more weight than before. The pier greeted me with the same hollow quiet. I reached the railing and stared across the black surface. No lights, just water. I stayed there for a long while, scanning and waiting. Then, faintly, a single glow appeared far out, lower than before, dimmer. It hovered for just a moment like a quiet reminder, and then it sank, gone again. The sky returned to darkness, leaving only the faint reflection of stars rippling across the calm water. The security light snapped on so suddenly it pulled me right out of my thoughts. I'd been standing at the kitchen sink halfway through rinsing a mug, barely paying attention to anything, when the backyard flooded with bright white light. The whole space outside the window lit up sharp and clean, like someone had flipped a switch just for me. My name's Evan Portillo, and the motion light almost never came on unless a raccoon wandered through or my neighbor's cat cut across the fence. It was around 11:20 at night, cold enough that my breath fogged the window when I leaned closer. The street was quiet, the whole neighborhood dim and still. I dried my hands on a towel and stepped closer to the glass, squinting out into the yard. Nothing moved. No animal, no shadow, no rustle of leaves. The security light washed over the grass, the old oak tree near the fence, and the narrow path of stepping stones I barely ever used. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 10 seconds earlier, just brighter now. I waited for something to shift. It didn't. The light stayed on, unblinking, as if it had found movement and frozen on that exact point. My chest tightened a bit. "That's weird," I muttered. I flipped off the kitchen light and stared harder. The yard was perfectly still, like time had decided to pause just out there and nowhere else. Even the usual sound of night insects felt faded. The curtains moved slightly behind me as cool air flowed through the cracked window, but outside the grass didn't sway. The oak leaves didn't twitch. The hedge near the fence stood frozen mid-motion. I stepped closer to the back door. Nothing. Just empty yard, glowing under harsh security light. After about 15 seconds, the light shut off. The darkness that followed felt heavier than it should have. I stood there staring into the unlit yard, suddenly more aware of how quiet everything had become. No rustle, no breeze, no normal nighttime noise, just still air and shadow. A strange unease crept in slowly, the kind that made the back of my neck tingle without giving me a clear reason to run. It wasn't panic. It was like the air itself felt off. I unlocked the back door without really thinking, pushed it open a few inches, and stepped onto the porch. Cold air wrapped around my arms immediately. The scent of damp soil clung faintly in the night. The yard stretched ahead, dark and silent. "And now you're just messing with me," I said quietly, half joking, half not. I took a cautious step off the porch and onto the stone path. The air felt dense, thick, like it didn't want to move. Even my breath sounded louder than usual. I reached the middle of the yard and turned slowly in place, scanning every corner. Fence line, trees, garden beds, nothing stood out. The stillness pressed down, and I realized just how quiet it really was. No insects, no distant traffic, no wind, just silence. Then, for a brief moment, the security light flicked on again. But this time, it flashed only once and turned off. The air didn't shift. It didn't get warmer. It just stayed too still. A faint pressure seemed to hang around me. Not enough to knock me back, just enough to notice, like being underwater but still breathing. "Yeah. Okay," I murmured, stepping backward. I headed back toward the porch, but slowed when I felt something change again, subtle and hard to define. The yard didn't look different, but it felt like something had settled in that hadn't been there before. The faint crunch of gravel came from near the fence. I froze. Nothing followed the sound. The gravel settled. I stared toward the corner of the yard, waiting for another sign. The security light didn't come back on, but a faint pale glow brushed the grass for just a moment, low and muted, not bright enough to cast real shadows. It hovered almost imperceptibly, as if the ground itself had briefly lit up under invisible moonlight. Then it faded. My heart started beating faster now. I stepped backward again, not taking my eyes off the spot where the glow had appeared. The air held the same heavy stillness, no movement, no explanation. Just that unnatural quiet stretching longer than comfort allowed. I backed up onto the porch, then into the house, and closed the door behind me a little too quickly for someone trying to stay reasonable. Inside, the normal hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the wall clock made the silence outside even more obvious by contrast. I leaned against the door for a second, listening for anything that might prove the world had gone back to normal. Nothing came. Eventually, I forced myself to glance out through the kitchen window again. The yard sat in darkness. No light. No movement. Everything looked normal now, like the last 5 minutes hadn't happened at all. I stayed there a while, just watching, waiting for either the light to snap on again or the air to start moving naturally. Neither happened. By the time I finally turned off the kitchen light and walked down the hallway toward my bedroom, my nerves still felt stretched thin, like something unfinished hung in the quiet. Later that night, when I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I swore I felt the same pressure settle for a second, like the room had grown denser without changing temperature. Then it disappeared. Outside, the yard stayed dark and motionless. No more flashing lights. No sounds. Just the same backyard I'd known for years, now holding a strange kind of stillness that never fully left my thoughts. The forest went quiet so fast it felt like someone had muted it. I noticed it mid-sentence, halfway through complaining to myself about the cheap tent zipper snagging again. 1 second there were crickets, beetles clicking against leaves, the low, steady buzz that always filled the air this time of night. The next, there was nothing, not a single chirp. I stopped moving and just listened. Silence. Not peaceful silence. Heavy silence. I was camping alone at Lake Arbordale, a small wooded site a half hour outside of Harrier's Point. It was early fall, still warm enough for mosquitoes, but cool enough to keep the sweat from sticking. The sky had been clear earlier, but low clouds had started rolling in around dusk, smudging the stars and making the trees look taller than usual. My name's Colin Dreyer. I'd done solo trips plenty of times. I knew the normal sounds of the woods. This wasn't normal. I stepped out from the tent, boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt. The lake shimmered faintly to my left, reflecting a weak sliver of moonlight that kept disappearing behind the clouds. Everything felt too still, like the air itself had paused. Seriously, I muttered, scanning the tree line. No movement. Leaves hung limp. Even the wind had died down. Then I saw it. A dim light hovered just above the tree line on the far side of the clearing. Not bright, not sharp, just a soft, pale glow sitting there, barely illuminating anything around it. It didn't cast beams. It didn't flicker. It looked like someone had drawn a faint circle of light and left it suspended in the air. I stared at it, unsure if I should blink. It wasn't rising. It wasn't falling. Just there. My stomach tightened in a slow, creeping way. "Okay," I whispered. "Nope." The silence around me felt wrong, like everything that usually lived out here had decided to hold its breath. The only sound I could hear was my own, shallow breathing. The glow shifted slightly, just a few inches, drifting sideways like it was following a path I couldn't see. The trees beneath it didn't brighten, the ground didn't reflect it. It existed without touching anything around it. I took one step back, then another. The dim light slid a little higher and then slowly dipped, as if fading behind the top of the trees without actually moving away. And then it vanished. Just gone. No flicker. No trail. No sign it had ever been there. Right after, the insects slowly crept back into the night, one chirp at a time, building until the forest sounded alive again. But the normal noise felt forced, like an echo of how things were supposed to be. I stood frozen, staring at the space where the light had hung. "Just pack up," I said to myself, voice barely steady. "Just pack and go." Still, I didn't move right away. I kept looking, as if I might spot it again, or catch some explanation, trying to emerge from the darkness. Nothing did. Finally, I turned back toward the tent and started shoving things into my bag with more force than necessary. I zipped it closed, slung it over my shoulder, and tried not to let my eyes wander too much. The walk back to the trailhead felt longer than it had earlier. Every small crack of a branch made my shoulders tense. Every brief rustle of leaves drew my attention sharp as a knife. About halfway down the path, something odd happened again. The night sounds dulled. Not full silence this time, but softened, as if a layer had been placed between me and the world. The air felt thick, almost pressurized. I slowed. Faintly ahead through the trees, I saw another glow. Smaller this time. Lower. It brushed the forest floor for a split second before lifting upward and dissolving into the darkness. My heartbeat thudded harder now. I didn't want to follow it. I also didn't want to turn my back on whatever direction it might choose next. So I stood there, frozen, waiting for something else to happen. It didn't. The glow never returned. The forest resumed its normal soundtrack, almost too cheerful in contrast. By the time I reached the parking area, my hands were shaky, even though the night air wasn't cold. I opened the trunk, tossed my pack inside, and got into the driver's seat with more relief than I'd expected. I sat there for a minute, just breathing,